In 1701, Captain Kidd was condemned as a pirate.
Arch pirate and the common enemy of mankind.
But with his death, the mystery of Kidd's hidden treasure was born.
Kidd was the only one who actually buried his treasure.
Over the centuries, many adventurers have tried to find his hoard. No one tried harder than Englishman Richard Knight.
He got taken over by the ghost of Captain Kidd.
This is a tale of epic sea voyages, unimaginable riches lost, secret compartments found, hidden treasure maps where X marks the spot, clues to the buried millions.
And I said, "Have you really found it, Richard?" And he said, "Yes, I have."
But Knight's daring expedition lands him in a Vietnamese jail, fearing for his life. He risked everything to unearth Captain Kidd's legendary treasure. Richard Knight was an unlikely treasure hunter. He was born in a quiet English seaside town, but he was destined not to lead a conventional, quiet life.
He was a curious figure, Richard Knight. I mean, he was not like many people you meet these days. You may perhaps have met them in the 19th century, but I don't think you met them in the 20th century, and probably even less now.
Knight was a young man in the early 1960s when he moved to Paris. As a bon vivant, he enjoyed all that the city and the changing times had to offer.
He was an adventurer, a chancer. I think that he wanted to enjoy life. He wanted to have seen everything, experienced everything.
But Richard Knight was an entertainer, an actor. And he had come to Paris not just to have fun, but to study with the master of French mime, Marcel Marceau. He even had some success in his career. Knight played opposite the great Jacques Tati in his film comedy Playtime as a confused drunk. But it seems he never settled anywhere for long.
He was hapless with a rucksack on his back. He was always footloose and fancy-free.
By 1978, Knight had travelled to Hollywood in an attempt to further his career as an actor. He never imagined his life was about to be given an entirely new direction. Not by a casting director, but by the actions of a man 300 years earlier. Captain William Kidd.
Suddenly he was inhabited by the ghost of Captain Kidd, another chancer from a much earlier century. And that's what I think happened to Richard. He got obsessed by the ghost of Captain Kidd.
Richard Knight was a voracious reader, and the books in the UCLA library drew him deeper and deeper into the extraordinary story of the infamous pirate. A tale of hardship and ill fortune, full of surprises.
Kidd was born in Dundee on the east coast of Scotland around 1655, but he went to New York, and it was there that he became a seaman, and he essentially worked his way up right through the ranks from a cabin boy to a sea captain. It became one of the best respected sea captains in the Americas.
In an unexpected twist, Knight discovered that when Captain Kidd sailed from London in February 1696, it was not as a pirate, but the very opposite, a pirate hunter, working for a consortium of wealthy English aristocrats and merchants. Britain's flourishing economy was largely built on trade with India. The ships of the British East India Company had been making huge profits, but the company had a growing problem: pirates. Disaster struck when English pirate Captain Avery teamed up with 5 other pirate captains to attack the Indian Mughal Emperor's convoy. They took a mammoth haul of over 500,000 gold and silver coins. The furious Mughal Emperor retaliated. His army attacked the company, and he threatened to put an end to English trade in India altogether. Captain William Kidd was commissioned by the British to hunt the pirates down. Not as an officer in the Royal Navy, but as a privateer.
A privateer is somebody who has a ship and a crew who gets a license, a letter of marque, to go out and hunt down the enemies of the state.
Kidd was given command of a newly built, powerful ship, the 34-gun Adventure Galley. So great was the crisis that Kidd's letter of marque, giving him permission to seize pirates, their ships, and their treasure in the king's name, was signed by King William III himself.
He was a well-respected, hard, experienced sea captain. He felt he had the skills and the ship and the expertise to pull this one off.
Kidd also had an added bonus. Britain was at war with France, so he could seize any enemy French ships he found. It was a confident Captain Kidd who set sail in the expectation that his share of the spoils would soon make him rich in captured ships and treasure. And the crew were also eager.
It was actually one of the best, most lucrative opportunities that these people had in the late 17th century.
The crew drew no pay. Their reward was a share of any ships and cargo taken, a system called no prey, no pay. Captain Kidd's 18-month privateer cruise was expected to pay from £500 to £3,500 per man, when the wage of a merchant seaman was just £45 a year.
An average seaman could actually make a small fortune from one good prize, one very lucrative prize. His normal cut would be enough to probably set himself up in business. He could buy a tavern, he could buy a farm, but essentially it was the big payload available to the late 17th century seaman.
As the Adventure Galley rounded the Horn of Africa, cannon at the ready, Kidd was expecting to encounter and conquer the pirates in their popular haunts off Madagascar and in the Indian Ocean. But there was a serious problem. They weren't there.
By the time he got to the Indian Ocean, all the ships he encountered were ones of allies, were English or Dutch ships. He couldn't find pirates, he couldn't find Frenchmen. So as the months rolled by and the crew weren't getting paid, things started to go badly wrong for him.
At the end of their planned 18-month cruise, not a single pirate ship or substantial French prize had been taken. The rebellious crew wanted to raid the next ship they came across. Any ship. They wanted to turn pirate.
When the crew knew they only earned money by taking other ships, they tended to take ships that maybe they shouldn't have.
The Adventure Galley had been at sea for 2 years with little to show for it. The crew took to torturing prisoners to find cash aboard any ships they encountered. Damning accounts from southern African ports where these ships fled began to arrive in London and New York. Captain Kidd was labelled pirate, and that meant the death penalty at the end of a rope. Knight learned that to calm his mutinous crew, enrich his powerful backers in London and save his own skin, Kidd needed a miracle. One big ship, pirate or French, loaded to the gunwales. As if in answer to Kidd's prayers, a cry rang out from the masthead. A ship had been sighted. a large, heavily laden merchant ship.
In January 1698, he hit the jackpot. He found a ship called the Quetta Merchant, which contained a lot of valuable silks, gold jewellery. It was the mother lode. At last, he'd found the right ship.
The Quetta Merchant was no fighting pirate ship, but when her captain showed him French papers, Kidd could snap her up as a legitimate prize. The riches aboard the Quetta Merchant are well documented. On board were pounds of gold, silver and jewels, as well as bales of fine silk and opium. Valued at up to £400,000 at the time, over £60 million today. Kidd's hunt for treasure was over. Now he could return home to New York in triumph to remove the stain on his reputation that he had turned pirate. But what seemed to be Kidd's salvation turned out to be a disaster. In New York, Kidd was swiftly arrested. The Quetta Merchant was not French, but belonged to a powerful Indian trader. Captain Kidd, who had been sent pirate hunting to pacify the Indian Moguls, had instead made the situation much worse. After capturing their treasure ship, the Indian merchants were demanding Kidd's blood. The British government were determined to pacify the all-powerful Indian merchants and desperate to safeguard the lucrative Far East trade. To buy his freedom, Kidd told of a treasure chest he'd buried on a nearby island. When the governor of New York, Lord Bellamont, dug it up, he found £14,000 in gold and jewels, worth today £2 million. But it bought Kidd no reprieve. The Indian emperor was baying for Kidd's blood, and the hapless Captain Kidd was shipped back to England to face trial for piracy and the hangman's rope.
This was no ordinary trial. This wasn't justice. This was retribution. His name was so blackened that everyone just thought, this man's a pirate.
Kidd's big mistake was to fail to copy the French pass he was given when he captured the Quetta Merchant. Without it, he couldn't prove that he had seized the ship legitimately. Now, at trial, when he needed it most, the French pass was nowhere to be seen.
The crucial piece of evidence, those French passes, which proved that he'd been behaving legitimately, had mysteriously disappeared. So he was essentially hung out to dry.
And Kidd faced not only a trial for piracy. Just to make sure he met the hangman, they also tried him for murder. In the darkest days of Kidd's voyage, when he was struggling to contain his rebellious crew's piratical exploits, a fatal incident occurred. The Adventure Galley encountered a Dutch ship, a British ally, and when Kidd refused to attack her, the crew were close to mutiny.
The gunner was the ringleader of a rather mutinous group of the crew who just wanted to capture it and ransack it, and that's when Kidd came to blows with the gunner.
Kidd, in his rage, grabbed an iron-bound wooden bucket and swung it at the argumentative gunner. The pail struck the gunner in the head, knocking him unconscious. Kidd had quelled the mutiny, but next day, the gunner died.
Killing a gunner is not a normal step for a sea captain, but in the instance of mutiny, those things are acceptable. And while Kidd knew he'd gone pretty far, he certainly didn't expect to be accused of murder for it.
In court, 2 of Kidd's former crew were given an amnesty to turn against him. They declared on oath that Kidd's fatal attack on the gunner had been premeditated murder.
The whole thing was just raced through so that they wanted a verdict, and they wanted one particular verdict, which is Kidd had to hang.
On the 9th of May 1701, Captain William Kidd was sentenced to be hanged. In a desperate attempt to escape his fate, he played what he hoped was a trump card. From his cell in Newgate Jail, he wrote a pleading letter to the government bargaining for his life.
I do most humbly pray that you will be pleased to represent to the Honourable House of Commons that in my late proceedings in the Indies I have lodged goods and treasure to the value of £100,000, which I desire the government may have the benefit of.
Kidd was claiming he'd hidden a second, much greater treasure, what would now be worth £15 million, and that if they would spare his life, he would lead them to it.
That's the germ that's sparked the interest of a lot of sort of treasure hunters ever since.
It was in this letter that the legend of Captain Kidd's vast buried treasure was born. So certain was Kidd about the hoard, he made it clear that they should hang him if he did not deliver.
If I fail therein, I desire no favour, but to be forthwith executed according to my sentence. Sir, your unfortunate humble servant, William Kidd.
The government, however, stood to lose a far greater sum than £15 million. All trade with India. It did not take the bait. The Indian moguls had to be appeased with Kidd's very public death. Under the rules of the Admiralty, Captain Kidd was taken onto the Thames foreshore at Wapping, London, between the low tide and the high water mark, to be hanged. But his execution did not go smoothly. When he was turned off the ladder, the rope snapped.
He must have thought he's actually had the first lucky break he's had for about 6 years, where often that's seen as a legitimate reprieve. In Kidd's case, he was just marched back up onto the scaffold, a new rope was found, and he was shoved off into oblivion.
The Admiralty, however, did not consider merely hanging pirates enough of a deterrent. Kidd's body was chained to a post in the Thames until the tide had washed over it 3 times. The body, painted with pitch, hung for over 2 years in a gibbet by the Thames estuary as a warning to passing sailors not to turn pirate. But the legend of Kidd's treasure would never die. Almost 300 years later, in Santa Monica, on the coast of Southern California, Richard Knight was hooked by the mystery of where Kidd's treasure lay buried. And he was determined to find it. Knight launched his treasure quest from the University of California, Los Angeles Library. From that moment on, his life was changed forever.
He got this idea, this obsession in his mind, and from then on he focused on it. Rich was a fairly rare character in that he really wasn't interested in money. He talks about the value of kids' treasure and being millions and countless millions. But I think it was the attraction of the adventure to him.
As Knight investigated, he found that others had dreamed of finding Kidd's treasure. And like them, he discovered that Kidd had left behind a trail of clues. Kidd's treasure trail starts in 1929 on the south coast of England in Eastbourne. It was the hometown of middle-aged bachelor Hubert Palmer. He was a retired solicitor who loved to collect pirate relics.
One day in 1929, he came in possession of an old oak bureau that was reputedly once belonged to Captain Kidd. And it had a brass plate attached to the front, William Kidd, Adventure Galley, 1696.
Whilst writing at the bureau one day, Palmer must have leant on it a little more than usual. One of the supporting runners broke off.
When Palmer examined it, he saw on the end, in wax, a very small impression of an anchor. He guessed something must be inside this runner, so he carefully took the wax imprint from the end, and inside he found a brass tube.
Knight discovered that Palmer had found wrapped around the brass tube a parchment. It was a map, a treasure map. On it, X marked the spot, just as in the story Treasure Island. But there was more. At the top were the words China Sea, on the left a compass north bearing, and at the bottom Kidd's initials, WK.
Palmer immediately suspected that this possibly was the hiding place of Kidd's treasure. But of course, there was nothing on the chart to say where it was.
Far from telling Knight where Kidd's treasure was, Palmer's chart left him with a fascinating glimpse of a mystery. His head buzzed with questions of how to solve it. Fortunately, in the 1930s, Hubert Palmer had uncovered more clues.
After that, Palmer devoted a lot of his time and energies to advertising for anything to do with Kidd, any relics, any chests, boxes, anything, hoping to find further evidence of where this island might be.
Knight learned that Palmer advertised for any objects belonging to Kidd, and slowly he found them.
3 years after Palmer found the oak bureau, he was offered this chest.
The chest came from a nautical man, Captain Morgan, who claimed descent from notorious buccaneer Sir Henry Morgan. Another of his light-fingered ancestors had been jailer at Newgate Prison, and when Kidd was hanged, the jailer took the chest.
He could see inlaid in brass on the top of the lid a skull and crossbones and the letter K. On opening the chest, he was amazed to see inside, attached to a false bottom, a plaster cast skull fixed to a plaster cast Bible. It is believed the skull was there for the crew to swear allegiance to the captain or the crown, hand on the skull with the Bible in the hand.
Disappointingly, the false bottom was empty, but there was something else mysterious there. When Palmer turned the board over, he discovered a mirror. What was it doing there?
Palmer examined the beading around here and discovered that This particular part of the beading quite easily came off. He was then able to slide the mirror and out like that. And lo and behold, to his great excitement, there was another chart.
Knight, just like Palmer, was excited by the fact that the outline of this chart was almost identical to the first one, but it contained more information.
515 southeast by 50 north, 36 northeast rocks, 3 feet by 3 feet by 4.
Knight now became convinced these were directions to the treasure. But apart from the clue China Sea, he had no idea of the island's whereabouts. No latitude or longitude. He needed more. Fortunately for Knight, Palmer had another piece of extraordinary good luck. When 2 years later, he was able to buy a chest that once belonged to Captain Kidd's wife, Sarah.
This is known as Sarah Kidd's workbox. There is an inlaid brass plate on the top which says William and Sarah Kidd, their box, 1699.
Meticulous as always, Palmer measured the box inside and out. There was a discrepancy, leading him to suspect a secret compartment in the base.
Palmer discovered on the end that there were 2 or 3 hidden nails or screws disguised in there. He eventually managed to undo these and work this beading edge off, and this revealed the hidden compartment underneath. He probed inside and discovered a parchment showing another chart.
This chart was more detailed. Knight first tried to decipher what had to be Kidd's own writing around the map's edge. After much puzzling, he had it.
360 yards, veer right, north 3 stumps, 87 feet from the centre of triangle in left rocks, 98, 20 feet east of skeleton of Lieb.
The final word remained a mystery, but Knight knew these were more detailed instructions of where to find the buried treasure. Crucially, this chart showed latitude and longitude. Knight now had what he needed, a way to pinpoint the island itself. But there was a snag. The longitude was hard to read. If the longitude was read as 3130 east, that put the island in the Sudan. Perhaps the mark before 31 could be a figure 1. But 131.30 east put the island 200 miles off the Philippines in open ocean. Knight realized there was a fundamental problem with the longitude. The modern maps Knight examined used the International Zero Meridian passing through the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, London. But then he realized charts in Captain Kidd's time referenced other zero meridians. The French favoured Paris. The Spanish, Cadiz. The high mountain of Tenerife was also popular with seafarers. The longitude of the treasure island would depend on which chart Kidd had been using.
So when looking at a chart of the 17th century or earlier, you had to know what meridian was in use at that time. And that's one of the problems with these charts. What meridian did Kidd use?
Richard Knight began to study atlases from the 16th to the 18th century. They were beautiful and ornate, and none recorded longitude from the zero meridian at Greenwich. Knight applied the Kidd treasure map longitudes. The first, 3130 east, put the island in Nigeria. No good at all. But the second longitude, 13130 east, indicated the island lay somewhere between Burma and the Philippines. That meant the South China Sea. This was more like it. China Sea, just as on the Kidd treasure maps.
Slowly he put together this idea that he had solved the mystery that nobody else had.
Knight now consulted chart after chart, scanning thousands of islands, looking for an island that matched the old parchments. Then, at last, on French Admiralty Hydrographic Chart number 3686 of 1879, there it was. Hon-Tre-Lon. Right shape, right orientation, right name. Hon-Tre-Lon is called in English Grand Pirate Island. But it was right in the worst possible spot imaginable. Hon-Tre-Lon was in the territorial waters of a country which, after a long, bitter war with the USA, was hostile to Westerners. Communist Vietnam.
Nobody had looked there because of the Vietnam War, because they were communist, because the politics had changed. It wasn't a place where you did pitch up and suddenly look for treasure. So he decided that he was the person who was going to brave all the odds and go and prove to the world that his theory was right.
International treasure hunting is an expensive business. Knight, looking to fund his expedition to Kidd's forbidden treasure island, set out his stall in Sydney, Australia. Using all his skills as an entertainer and storyteller, he tried to lure wealthy Australian businessmen into his romantic quest.
Of course, he was always on the lookout for a backer who might help. So, he used to pick up these extraordinary figures, go off with them, trying to persuade them that to come in with him to this sort of madcap mission.
Slowly, Richard Knight managed to draw together a small group to buy into his dreams of treasure. But his charm would never convince the Vietnamese government to let him go on a treasure hunt. He would need a cover story. To explain his need for a metal detector without arousing suspicion, Knight and his backers decided to write asking for official permission to prospect for minerals. On a business letter headed the Australian Pacific Geological and Mining Company, they made their pitch, ending,
hoping we may have your favourable consideration for this application, as we believe that it may have considerable interest and potential benefit to the Socialist Republic of Vietnam.
It didn't work. There was no reply from the Vietnamese. Knight decided through a travel agent to simply ask to visit Hon-Tre-Lon as a tourist. This time he did get a reply, but it exactly followed the Communist Party line.
We regret the areas you have stipulated in your request are not now possible to visit. Only published areas through our approved agency in Australia possible.
The political climate of the Cold War left no legitimate way for Richard Knight to get to Hon-Tre-Lon. Gradually, his backers backed away.
And so he was now left on his own. And all his backers dropped out. And rather than say, you know, well, I'm not going to do this until I've got it properly organised, he thought, well, what the hell? I'm going to do it myself.
By June 1981, Richard Knight had decided that the only way to reach his treasure island was to mount an illegal expedition. The first step of his personal invasion was to get as close to Vietnam as he could. He decided to base himself in Bangkok, Thailand. But this was still over 300 miles by sea from Hon Tre Lon, a very dangerous voyage. Finding a boat for hire that was large enough but inconspicuous enough to sneak him within striking distance of Hon Tre Lon would be tricky. On top of that, he had to find a willing crew.
I think Rich found it difficult to persuade totally legitimate, solid citizens to go in with him because of his nonchalant character, his habit of whizzing off and disappearing, or not being totally practical, perhaps, or they came to that view. And so he was thrust on unusual characters like himself.
Knight now took a leaf out of Captain Kidd's book, offering a share of the treasure. But still, he could induce no one to volunteer for such a risky voyage. Then a friend introduced him to a fresh-faced 18-year-old American, Fred Graham.
But in the end, he found, you know, the perfect person, really, a young photojournalist who also wanted an adventure.
Fred Graham had left home in California with a new camera to become a war photographer. But with no experience, he couldn't break into the profession. He was at a dead end, and Richard Knight's treasure hunt offered just the kind of excitement he was looking for. Knight offered him 15% of the treasure. Graham negotiated his share up to 40%. They had a deal. But just like Kidd's crew, if they found no treasure, he would get nothing. The decision to go with Knight would cost him dear. Just 2 days later, towards the end of May 1983, Knight and Graham were in high spirits as they set their bow into the Gulf of Thailand. Knight had persuaded a local crew to accept his bizarre charter, and they were off on their adventure to unearth the legendary treasure of Captain Kidd. It took several days and nights to reach the island Knight had picked out from the old charts. But fortune seemed to smile on the voyage. The Gulf was the haunt of real 20th century cutthroat pirates. Knight and Graham were well equipped for treasure hunting with a metal detector and digging equipment, but not for rappelling boarders. But they passed through without incident. After days at sea, Knight and Graham landed on their treasure island. Knight's crazy plan seemed to be working rather well. All was quiet, and Knight decided that they would wait until first light to unearth the legendary treasure of Captain Kidd. It had, after all, waited almost 300 years. He could surely wait one more night. But what he didn't know was, they'd been seen. The Vietnamese had endless questions to fire at Richard Knight. Who are you? Where are you from? What is this equipment for? Any answers to do with treasure hunting were met with scorn. They were convinced he was an American spy working for the Western imperialist CIA. Knight and Graham were imprisoned in rat and cockroach-infested cells, separated in solitary confinement. If Knight couldn't overturn the spy story, he faced a similar fate to Captain Kidd: execution. Again and again he was interrogated. Again and again he had another confession to sign. What he told them of his globe-trotting acting career was to them an elaborate cover story. What is all this equipment for? Who, they kept asking him, was his contact in the British government? Richard Knight didn't have a contact in the British government. He wished he had. Not a soul even knew he was missing, let alone where he was and the danger he was in. Captain Kidd at least had treasure to bargain with. Knight had nothing. More than once, when the militia took him from his cell, Knight believed that he was to be shot.
I think he weathered jail quite well. He had all sorts of diversionary tactics to fall back on.
He took to playing imaginary games of golf, reliving visits to Blackpool, analysing gambling systems and besting imaginary opponents with a homemade pack of cards.
He could always find something within himself to withstand those long solitary and potentially dangerous situations, largely because there's a huge imagination, I think.
But as month after month passed, Knight fought for his sanity. He gave each corner of the cell a function, one to look to the future, another to look to the past, one for prayer, another for comedy. But after 4 months with no contact from either the British or US governments, it seemed he might never get out alive. But he was unaware there was one faint hope. Just before the ill-fated treasure hunt, young Fred Graham had wisely arranged for a letter to be posted to his father if he wasn't back in 30 days. He wrote,
"If you're reading this letter, something has gone very wrong. Either I am dead or in prison."
Graham's letter saved them both. With the news that Knight and Graham had gone to Vietnam, the British and US embassies launched investigations. The Minister of State at the Foreign Office, Richard Luce, also the Knight's local MP, wrote to Knight's mother.
"You can rest assured that the embassy will continue to press the Vietnamese to let them know where your son is being held."
The diplomatic activity worked. The Vietnamese admitted they had arrested Knight and Graham for violating the territory of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and they were in prison. But now the Vietnamese played pirate, demanding a ransom of $10,000 per man. But neither the US nor the British government would pay a penny.
The British government would not pay a ransom, would they? They don't pay official ransoms. They always make a thing of, we don't pay, otherwise it just happens again.
By the 17th of May 1984, Fred Graham was free and returned to America, 40 pounds lighter than when he had left home on his adventures. His family and friends in California had raised the money, limiting his captivity to less than a year. The unfortunate Richard Knight stayed in jail. The British vice-consul in Hanoi wrote to Knight.
I know that Frederick Graham's departure must have left you feeling depressed, but please be assured your mother and friends are still working hard to raise the money to pay your fine.
After over a year in captivity, they'd raised only $2,000, still $8,000 short. Knight waited in prison alone through June and July. But then in August, the British consul wrote to tell him he'd had an extraordinary stroke of luck.
A particularly generous offer from a British citizen living in California means that the balance of the fine is now available.
In early August 1984, Richard Knight received the greatest treasure of all. His freedom. In the years that followed, Fred Graham's thirst for adventure remained unquenched. He succeeded in working as a photojournalist, and also, ironically, for the CIA during the US war in El Salvador. Now, he is an author of political thrillers. But Richard Knight never stopped looking for the treasure.
He doesn't seem to have regretted having done this, or having done it in this harebrained way. And he never lost the dream. I know he didn't lose the dream because, you know, when I last said goodbye to him, he was off back to China to find a backer to go and pick up the treasure.
Knight, stranded in China, out of funds and out of luck, telephoned a stranger for help, fellow treasure hunter George Edmonds.
Well, what could I do? I mean, he needed money to get out. So I agreed to send him some money if he agreed to tell me the true story. And I said, "Have you really found it, Richard?" And he said, "Yes, I have."
Edmonds never saw Knight or his money again. Richard Knight died in Carlisle in the north of England in 2002. So what is the truth of Kidd's legendary treasure? There's no doubt that he did bury a chest containing £14,000 that was dug up at the time on the orders of Lord Bellamont, Governor of New York. But what of Kidd's claim to have had a further £100,000 hidden away?
The question is, of course, was Kidd 100% truthful about how much shiny gold and jewellery he actually found and hid?
Did Captain Kidd really intend to guide a ship to a vast buried hoard? Or was the treasure a last desperate bid for his life? Did he intend, once at sea, to pull off a daring escape?
I'd be very surprised if any treasure is found, any of Kidd's treasure ever comes to light. I think Lord Bellamont basically managed to get his hands on the entire haul.
Nothing, it seems, puts off a dedicated treasure hunter. For George Edmonds, this dark cloud still has the glint of a silver lining. He believes he has properly deciphered the Kidd treasure maps.
The charts do lead to a treasure, but it is nothing whatsoever to do with Kidd.
Edmonds believes he has located a new treasure island where no treasure hunters have been before. Just like Richard Knight, just like every serious treasure hunter, George Edmonds plays his cards very close to his chest while he seeks backers for his expedition.
I can't tell you where this island is because it is the result of 8 years of intensive research. Everything is in there. The solution of the clues on the charts, where this other island is, what the treasure is, and where it is.
It seems that dreams of buried treasure never die.
So it's still out there. I'm very confident of that.
Shrouded in mist and isolated in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, 350 miles off the South American coast of Costa Rica, lies a deserted island called Cocos.
Cocos is hidden away, and for that reason, it was more a myth. Some weren't sure that it existed.
In the 18th and early 19th century, ruthless pirates paid regular visits to Cocos.
There are so many accounts of how pirates buried treasures on this island.
Some say that millions of dollars of gold and precious stones still lie hidden under its coconut trees, rocks, and caves.
If someone was talking about Treasure Island on those days, always was Cocos.
Over the years, hundreds of men have battled against the island's incessant rain, the searing heat, and unyielding soil to search for the treasure. Some stayed for months, most left within days. But one man spent 17 years on the island looking for it. His name was August Gissler.
There was no turning back, as long as there was blood in his veins and breath in his lungs.
To some treasure hunters, his was a magnificent passion, but to others, it's a tale of greed and obsession. This is the story of August Gissler's amazing quest to find the pirate treasure on Cocos Island. (1881). A British sailing ship was en route to Hawaii's capital city, Honolulu. On board was a 23-year-old German engineer named August Gissler.
He's the son of a knife manufacturer, I think the third of 11 children. One can imagine that that's potentially a stifling place to be. He was expected to follow his elder brother into the knife manufacturing business and, in the family firm, and instead Gissler put to sea.
Gissler's voyages took him all over the world, and along the way, he met some unusual companions. Gissler befriended a young Portuguese traveler, Manuel Cabral, and they fell deep into conversation.
We were sitting a lot of time together with this young man. They're drinking a lot of rum, and they were telling a lot about families and things.
Over the weeks that they were at sea together, they grew to trust each other and appreciate each other's company.
One evening, a sailor by the name of Old Jack walked by. And Cabral said that he looked like a pirate. Gissler told him those days were over and asked why he mentioned the word pirate. Cabral answered, "Old Jack fits the description of my grandfather's life. He was a sailor and sailed this very ocean."
Cabral mentioned that the reason he was so far from home was that he was hoping one day to reach an island where there was something very special hidden. And he produced from an oilskin folder an account written by his grandfather of his life.
The diary was the autobiography of a pirate in the early 1800s. Cabral's grandfather wrote of how, when he was a young fisherman, he and his boat were blown off course with a broken mast and picked up by a pirate ship.
They were pressed into service and found themselves working for one of the greatest and most notorious and most charismatic pirates of the day, which was Don Pedro Benito, Bloody Sword Bonito.
That was the moment when Gizler was hooked by the story. He must have been really fascinated by this diary of a real pirate.
It was a tale of buccaneers, Spanish galleons, and murder on the Pacific. Piracy was a lucrative industry in the early 19th century, and Bloody Sword Benito ruled the waves.
They would sometimes attack villages on the shore, sometimes they would attack a Spanish galleon. One very famous occasion, they took some priests along with their treasure on board.
One section of the diary made Gissler's heart race. It told of a time when the pirates had just stormed a Spanish galleon loaded with treasure. And they were now looking for somewhere to bury it all.
You can't put in at port with a whole load of jewels without raising some notice. People are going to wonder, where did it come from?
You've got to put the stuff somewhere safe.
You can sell tobacco in any old port and it'll move quickly, but you know, you have a golden chalice. It's a little bit harder to work with.
One particular passage really drew Gissler in. Cabral's grandfather described where they were going to bury the treasure.
A few days after our capture, the lookout reported an island ahead. From far off, we could see a huge waterfall and high mountains on each side. Three boats landed the treasure on a shore near a coconut grove. There was a stream running close into the sea.
Gissler read how Cabral's grandfather and the captain followed the stream for half a mile inland and came across another coconut grove where they decided to conceal their plunder.
Now, there were no numbered Swiss bank accounts in those days, so it had to be put safely in a hiding place that had to have two distinct qualities. One, it must be very difficult to find. And two, it must be possible for you to locate it because you have certain information which no one else has got access to.
Gissler now read what seemed to reveal the exact location of where Cabral's grandfather buried the pirate treasure.
I dug a hole in the ground. The treasure was piled into the hole. The captain took exact bearings, but he did not tell me what they were. I took my own bearings from the mouth of the stream in line with the round rock, which is about 600 feet west by south from the mouth of the stream and about 20 feet back of the coconut grove.
The document was completely unique, and I think Gissler knew this right away. It gave detailed descriptions of what the treasure was and where the treasure was buried. Landmarks, for instance, numbers of paces from the spot where it would be buried.
You can understand how exciting it must have been for August Gissler when he's on board the ship. and it becomes more and more clear that what he is looking at is a pirate document with essentially directions to the treasure.
These were the most extraordinary pages Gissler had ever read. He now realized that not only did they give precise directions as to where the treasure was buried, they had never been published or shown to anyone else before. But there was something missing.
While Gissler had an awful lot of information about the whereabouts of this buried treasure, he lacked one crucial thing, and that was the name of the island itself.
"169 days after leaving London, Gissler's ship finally reached Hawaii's capital, Honolulu. By now, he's desperate to know the island's name and needs to raise enough money for an expedition to go and search for the treasure.
Gissler arrived in Hawaii and he immediately began looking for work. Took a while, but eventually ended up finding some on a plantation.
While Gissler worked on a banana farm, he had a chance encounter in a bar with a man named Bartels. Here, he heard of another link to the buried treasure. Bartels told him about his wife's father, a man named Old Mac.
Gissler was to learn that Old Mac had actually known the pirate Benito Bonito as well. He'd been involved in the capture of a Spanish galleon off the coast of Acapulco and had sailed to an island where the treasure was buried.
Gissler's ears pricked up. He wondered if this was the same island as the one in Cabral's grandfather's diary. Bartels handed Gissler Old Mac's chart and said that he had set off in 1852 to search for Benito's buried treasure on an island called Cocos, but had run out of money before he got there.
Old Mac was in the possession of what appeared to be pirate maps and instructions to the treasure on an island that he knew as Cocos Island.
But where was this mysterious island? The chart revealed an island with 2 mountains and 2 bays at the northeast and northwest ends. The island's position was latitude 527 degrees north and longitude 87 degrees west. Compass bearings from the 2 points were given where these 2 lines cross, and the treasure's hiding place was marked. And there were even more clues.
When Gissler examined these papers, to his excitement and interest, he discovered that the description of Cocos Island was almost exactly the same as the island that Cabral had told him about.
Critically, Cabral's grandfather's tale talked about 2 mountains. So did Old Mac's charts.
He has finally found out from the Bartels the name of the island, and it's Cocos.
Cocos is famous for buried treasure because there are so many accounts of how pirates buried vast hoards of gold, rubies, and silver on this island, and for various reasons couldn't come back to retrieve it. In many cases because they were hanged or lost at sea.
Gissler is now convinced that the treasure could still be there and is determined to find it. Gissler wrote how before he left, Bartels gave him one word of caution.
Don't take too many hands to the island, and don't let a living soul know what you're after. You might not only lose your treasure, but also your life.
Ignoring the warning, Gissler eventually managed to get a ride on a Swedish sailing ship, whose captain promised to drop him off on Cocos on their way to Chile. But very quickly, Bartel's words seemed to come into play. The ship was poorly manned, and the winds and sea were against them. First, they were hit by a storm. And then worse. They had no winds at all. Gissler described his journey.
We were only 350 miles from the island and thought we could easily make it in a week's sailing, but very light winds prevailed, and 14 days elapsed before we sighted Cocos. At that point, we were becalmed again, and that night we lost sight of the island completely.
The Swedish sailing ship drifted around the Pacific Ocean for another week, and then finally, the captain was forced to abandon the Cocos Island drop-off. They had no option but to carry on to Chile. 73 days after leaving Honolulu, and over 3,000 miles away from Cocos Island, they arrived in Chile, South America, with Gissler still on board. In Chile, the Swedish crew introduced him to a captain of a whaling company who told Gissler he had been to Cocos Island on several occasions.
Once, in 1875, he had fallen in with an American expedition looking for the treasure where they had been digging close to the beach. This interested me, as the plans I had in my possession pointed to the cache being a good way inland.
Over the next few months, Gissler talked to local merchants and dockside workers to gain funds for another trip to Cocos Island.
It takes him some time to get himself together and arrange his affairs, but he manages in Chile to really incorporate a group of investors who are willing to travel with him to Cocos Island.
In late February 1889, and 8 years after first hearing Cabral's grandfather's story, Gissler finally set foot on Cocos Island. Now at last, Gissler can pursue his dream.
Cocos Island lies 550 kilometers off the coast of Costa Rica. It's part of the same volcanic chain as the Galapagos, so it just juts up out of the Pacific deep. It comes from something like 4 kilometers below sea level. It's just the top of a mountain peak. So what you see above the water is just the beginning. It's a jungle with mist and waterfalls cascading off the side of these granite cliffs. And it's really alone out there in the Pacific Ocean.
No permanent human settlement has ever survived here. Now Gissler and his men were the only ones on the island. Over the next few weeks, as the expedition party made a base camp, Gissler got the lay of the land. Looking up at the two mountains dominating the island, he opened his chart to survey the land.
The two were marked on my chart. From these mountains, two lines were drawn which joined a good way inland, and a large square had been drawn round the point where the lines intersected. The writing on the plan was in Spanish, but the mate translated it for us as follows. In 1821 we buried treasure here of immense value. After we had buried the treasure, we planted a coconut tree on top and took bearings by compass, which showed locations northeast by east half east to the East Mountain and north 10 degrees east to the West Mountain.
Gissler used the chart as a marker and set the party to work.
They uprooted trees. They searched caves. And they dug fresh approaches to existing tunnels. But all to no avail. And one by one, the party who had come so enthusiastically with Gissler began to drift away from the island until only 4 of them remained.
Gissler and his last 3 companions continued their search. They dug under every palm tree around the square marked on the chart. But after 10 months, exhausted and disillusioned, they left the island in December 1889 and returned to Chile. The following October, Gissler was back on the island. This time, he had a better equipped and supplied treasure hunting party. And very soon, he seemed to be getting results. One morning, Gissler dug up some 18th century Spanish gold coins. But the few gold coins proved to be their only find.
The expedition spent several months on the island digging and boring until we were forced to admit that we had no sure signs that we would strike anything in the near future. We therefore hove up anchor.
Gissler was now tormented with self-doubt. Had he fallen for the oldest treasure hunter folly of them all?
Everybody begins with a treasure map or some secret information that they believe that they are the only people in possession of. And you think, this will take me a week and I'll dig something up and I'll be rich and that will be it.
He didn't find the places they were described, and he didn't find the exact positions. I mean, that's a volcanic area, and the shape of the island is changing a lot.
Gissler went to the island and found that by following the instructions that he had, he didn't find the treasure. And I believe that the realization suddenly dawned on him that following these specific instructions was not going to work.
That realization was an epiphany for August Gissler. Although his best endeavors to find the treasure had all been failures, he would have to try an entirely new approach.
After a number of unsuccessful attempts with one small expedition after another, Gissler realized that the problem was so immense it was not going to be solved by one of these hit-and-run missions.
The key to any new approach, Gissler realized, was to expand the search area.
His plan was that he would go to the most likely place where the treasure was and start digging. And if that didn't work, he would increase his search area, increasingly larger and larger and larger.
The task of Gissler's proposal was immense. It would mean digging up the entire island and would take years. So the only way to do it, he believed, was to live on the island and, if necessary, devote his whole life to it.
I think it was clear to Gissler after his early attempts to search for the treasure that logistics were a major issue, and logistics are expensive. And financing it all himself could happen once, maybe twice, but I think the amount of effort and perhaps the extended nature of the search would necessitate a different kind of access.
To Gizler, the idea of spending long periods of time on the island made complete sense. Over the past 2 years, he had got to know the island's terrain and climate well. The soil, he believed, was rich and ready for cultivating, and there was an abundance of wild pigs, goats, and deer. He thought that if the land was farmed, it could easily be self-supporting for as long as he wanted it to be. Gissler then hit on the idea of forming an agricultural community to live on the island with him. Together, they would hunt for the treasure.
He wanted to colonize the island of Cocos. And he was claiming that he could grow all sorts of things on the island. He could grow the best tobacco. He could grow much more of it than they could per acre in Cuba. Lots of different varieties of bananas. Given that the island is mainly volcanic rock, and it's only got an area of about 5 miles by 2 miles, it was amazing how much Gissler was claiming.
He petitioned the president of Costa Rica to set up an agricultural colony that could be supplied by mailboat once a month, and provisions could be brought on. That would facilitate really a longer-term involvement with Cocos.
In July 1891, the Costa Rican president agreed to Gissler's plan and granted him certain rights to develop the island agriculturally.
He got permission from the Costa Rican authorities to set up a colony, and they agreed that if he could bring 50 families from Germany, they could live on it.
Gissler now had to raise the funds and to find 50 German families. With the colony rights in his pocket, he traveled around Europe, promoting his island scheme.
On those days, the German emperor was very interested to increase German colonies. So, and also this was a little bit the spirit of the days.
After Europe, Gissler then tried his luck in America. The New York Times would write of him, "Gissler is a breathing replica of Michelangelo's heroic statue of Moses. His reddish beard reaches to his waist. His hair is luxuriant on a splendidly poised head. His eyes are as clear and as searching as an eagle's. His nose is classic. His voice is profoundly mellow, fitting the man to perfection. His height is 6 feet 3 inches. He is built like a wedge, as a man should be, with massive shoulders. His hand is as big as the hand of Providence and so hard that his clenched fist is used as a spike maul." Nowhere were there any takers, not in Europe or America. Gissler was now desperate to get back to Cocos, but he was unable to raise the funds or the people to form a colony. He appealed again to the Costa Rican government to help him.
I explained to the president that it was impossible to raise any capital on the concession I had received in 1891, and he requested me to put down what I now desired, and he would see what he could do.
Gissler spelled out exactly the terms he would need to make the settlement work.
My demands were a gift of 1/2 of the island for myself, the other half to be laid out in sections for the settlers I proposed to bring. It took some time to win my point, but eventually the terms were granted.
This was the breakthrough Gissler had wanted. Now married to his wife Mary, Gissler again returned to Europe. This time, there were plenty of takers, and he was able to secure funds from his relatives and friends to transport the colonists over to the island.
My wife went with me to the island on the 13th of December 1894. From New York we brought lumber and building materials, provisions, and seeds. In Panama, we secured tropical plants, chickens, ducks and turkeys.
The German farming families began to build houses, and it looked as if everything was going to be all right.
Cocos Island represented everything that Germany of the time wasn't. It was wild, untamed. It's completely raw. It's isolated. It didn't involve being one of 11 children in a family enterprise, making knives. It was him doing his thing.
The first thing we did was to clear the land to plant cane, bananas, vegetables, and coffee.
On November the 11th, 1897, Gissler was even appointed governor of Cocos Island by the government of Costa Rica.
You head so far down a path, that path becomes who you are. And I think he was really happy to be the governor of Cocos Island.
At last, Gissler had the time, the resources, and the people to look for the treasure. He made regular explorations along the shorelines, and one day, there seemed to be another breakthrough. He came across more Spanish gold coins.
He offered parts of the island to his family members. So he really thought that he was securing his family's legacy for generations.
But Gissler's dreams quickly began to evaporate. The government boat requested by Gissler to drop supplies off to the island failed to show up after only making a few trips.
As no more ships came in, it was not long before we ran short of provisions. One of the settlers fell ill, his limbs became swollen, and soon after he died.
Gissler's problems didn't end there. The German colonists, who were promised the land of plenty, were struggling to grow vegetables in the tropical paradise.
Cocos Island has rather unusual soil. It's a grey type of sand or grey type of clay which holds water a few feet down and makes it very difficult indeed to grow anything.
Gissler knew he had to get more provisions if he and the colonists were going to survive and locate the treasure. He built a boat and took 4 men across the water to Costa Rica with him to help with the supplies. When he got there, there was another setback. As their boat was loaded, 3 of the men refused to return with him.
There was no use in trying to reason with these men and telling them what a cowardly thing it was to leave their wives. To bring the settlers over had cost a lot of money, but I thought it would be cheaper in the long run to get rid of them.
But Gissler's problems didn't stop there. When he returned, he found that the situation on the island had deteriorated even more. A plague of rats was attacking the colonists' children.
The island is full of rats, and so it didn't really go well for the colonists. I think that they had a desire or a vision of themselves as wealthy plantation owners, you know, in the Pacific, not as subsistence farmers whose children were being attacked by vermin.
The colonists now rebelled at the island's harsh conditions.
Most of them didn't want to really work hard, and coming from Germany, they are not used to this climate. Wet, 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 and humid and hot. And then they had to build their house, they have to cook their food, and they have to do everything.
As the colonists turned on Gissler, he confronted them.
One of the things about Gizler was not only his mental and physical strength and stamina, but his natural ability to command.
He said that on this island he's the governor, the judge, jury, and the executioner.
I thought they would raise crops and get rich, but in a short time they raised an insurrection instead. I declared martial law as governor of the island, and with my big pistols pointed in the faces of the Germans, I scared them into submission. They laid down what arms they had, and peace was restored.
Yet another problem hit Gissler's plans. His provisions quickly ran out, and he had to go back to the mainland for more. While Gissler was away, the island received some unexpected and unwelcome visitors. A British warship dropped anchor in Cocos Bay. Under the command of an Admiral Palliser, several platoons were dispatched ashore with shovels, picks, and a large quantity of dynamite. For the next few days, they proceeded to dig and blast huge holes all over the island, hoping to find the treasure. As Gissler's wife Mary tried to stop them, she was told to mind her own business. Yet despite all the craters they made, the British didn't find any treasure. When Gissler returned with new supplies, he complained about the incident.
In fairness to the Admiral's superiors and British diplomacy, let us say here that the Admiral was severely reprimanded for his unwanted intrusion on Cocos Island.
But it was a very minor victory, because Gissler's colony was disintegrating all around him.
It was a very miserable community because you and your immediate friends and neighbors were struggling just to keep alive, and all hopes of getting rich had long since gone. What had looked so promising at the beginning when the colonists arrived began to weaken and fade, and one by one they decided that there was no future for them as farmers on the Cocos plantation.
In 1902, Gissler and Mary were the only ones left on the island. But even then, Gissler was determined not to give up. Gissler had now been searching for over 16 years. And despite all his suffering, he was still convinced he could find the pirates' buried treasure. Out looking for it, he came across a large sign, hand-carved in the bark of a tree.
It said, "The bird is gone." And the question is, what does that mean? Who wrote it?
Was it a cryptic message? Did the bird mean the treasure? Had someone taken it? Had all Gissler's efforts been in vain?
I think the thing that is poignant to me is, do they know that the treasure is gone, or do they think that the treasure is gone? And I wonder how much that played on Gissler's mind all of the time after he'd found them.
Gissler was distraught. Questions began racing through his mind. Did one of the pirates return to the island to retrieve the treasure only to find out one of his shipmates had been there before him? Things were now really getting very desperate for him. No ship had called at the island for nearly a year. He had no ammunition left to shoot game, and he knew he had to make another trip to the mainland for them to survive.
There was no one on the island anymore besides his wife. It must have been a very great relationship. I mean, really very romantic. Every other woman probably would have left and said, well, he was a crazy guy.
Gissler patched up his small handmade boat again. He had no material left to make a sail, so he created one with some sheets off their bed. Gissler told his wife Mary he would be away for no longer than 4 to 6 weeks and set off to buy the supplies. But things didn't go to plan. As soon as he left Cocos, Gissler hit a terrible storm. And ended up in Panama, over 200 miles on from his original destination, the mainland of Costa Rica. Meanwhile, Gissler had left Mary completely abandoned.
So you have his wife living on the island on her own, one woman on her own, on an island in the middle of the Pacific, with only the barest rudiments for capturing her food. She created traps, she caught things. Did she eat rats? Perhaps.
was no one taking care for her, and she could easily have died on the island.
We can imagine how difficult that must have been for her.
Gissler finally made his way back to Cocos Island 6 months later. But this experience and the constant struggle to exist on the island finally got the better of them. Gissler left the island with Mary in 1908. They settled in New York, where they were supported by relatives. So does that mean that Gissler's efforts to find the pirates' treasure on Cocos Island was all in vain? Gissler had spent 17 years looking for the buried treasure on Cocos Island. But all he had found was a total of 33 gold pieces, minted between 1793 and 1799.
I wonder whether, looking back at the end of his life, did he feel as if those gold coins had somehow lured him into staying on when he should have given it up years before?
In the end, it was just a man who was desperately convinced that there was something on the island, doing whatever he could to find it, but didn't have any new evidence to be able to do it.
It's almost as though each coin that he had found had whispered to him like some mischievous sprite, "There is money here. Go on, August, keep digging."
Gissler died on the 8th of August, 1935. He was 78. In his will, he left half of Cocos Island to friends and relatives. He had estimated the value of his legacy to be around $200,000. But when the beneficiaries approached the Cocos government to claim their inheritance, they were told that because Gissler was only a temporary governor and never owned the island, his will was worthless. But there is another way at looking at Gissler's life. He may not have found what he was looking for, but it's a magnificent tribute to the human spirit that he endured for so long.
Most people that go to the island can only cope with maybe 1 or 2 weeks of digging, because in the end it tires you, it saps you. Even to have the physical and mental fortitude to survive on that island and to dig on that island for a few weeks is phenomenal. To do what Gissler did, which was to never give up, and to spend 17 years looking for the treasure, is a mark of an extraordinary human being.
Once he'd set out on his quest, there was no turning back, as long as there was blood in his veins and breath in his lungs.
Obsessed, maybe, but certainly passionate, certainly resourceful, and he was basically living his dream. Who can fault him for that?
The following words are believed to be the last he ever wrote.
The treasure is on the island, but it will take money and a good deal of effort to unearth it. I have gone through many hardships and dangers, and perhaps shall do so again, but this will not keep me away.
treasure of the mighty Aztec emperor Montezuma. When Spanish conquistadors invaded, the breathtaking haul vanished without a trace. Legend says the riches were taken far to the north, to the fabled land of Aztlan. The quest for Aztec gold began with a drifter who believed it was buried near a small town in America.
It's here. I believe that Montezuma's treasure is here someplace.
He was followed by others who came in search of the treasure.
They were seeing all kinds of ghostly figures.
Have they awoken an army of Aztec warriors?
There's people who've lost their lives.
And condemned this town to live under the curse of the fearsome Montezuma.
There is a curse that's keeping people from finding this treasure.
The quest started almost 100 years ago. One summer's day in 1914, a dusty old prospector cycled along Johnson Canyon in Utah, in the southwest of America. His name was Freddie Crystal, and he was in a hurry to get to a town called Kanab.
I am sure that the people of Kanab thought that Freddie sounded a bit mad, and he looked a bit mad. Wild-eyed and crazy hair, unshaven, not the typical person that comes into town.
And Freddie Crystal certainly had a wild tale to tell. He told the people of Kanab that the treasure of Montezuma was buried near their town. If they'd help him find it, they'd all get a cut. It wasn't the sort of story these no-nonsense folk were used to hearing.
The bulk of the people who lived in Kanab were members of the Latter-day Saint religion, the Mormons, and they were small-town folk. They lived very ordinary lives. They farmed, they ranched, they ran local stores.
Kanab would have been just a little farming community, people trying to scratch a life out of the dirt.
They didn't want much to do with anything with him or his treasure at that time.
Freddie simply couldn't understand how they could turn their backs on one of the world's largest hauls of riches. When the Spanish first saw the treasure, they were awestruck by the vast array of jade, turquoise, silver, and gold. But when the conquistadors ransacked the Aztec capital, they discovered that the treasure had vanished. When faced with an agonizing death, the Aztecs still refused to reveal where the treasure had been hidden. Freddie Crystal was convinced that the priceless hoard had been spirited away to southern Utah. His belief was absolute. The story of Aztec gold had come to him in a vision.
Before Freddie ever even got to Kanab, he was a prospector up in Idaho. He was working in a mine and he got hit in the head with a crowbar, which caused him to have what he called a panorama, which for most intents and purposes we would call a vision.
In the vision, Freddie said he had seen a large number of Aztec warriors leading a massive procession of slaves. This large group headed north and crossed the Rio Grande into what is now Texas. They then traveled across New Mexico into Arizona and finally reached the Colorado River. The Aztecs and the long line of slaves moved into what is now southern Utah. But then suddenly Freddie Crystal's vision started to fade. The Aztecs and the slaves completely disappeared. Then one image slowly emerged from the haziness. It was a type of ancient rock carving known as a petroglyph. Freddy was completely baffled. Why had he seen the warriors driving a slave train thousands of miles north from the Aztec lands to what is now southern Utah? Freddy decided to find out all he could about the history of the long-lost Aztec nation. His reading led him to the events surrounding the downfall of the once mighty Aztec Empire. Although the Aztecs were renowned for ruthless cruelty and mass blood sacrifice, they initially welcomed the Spanish conquistador, Hernán Cortés. Cortés couldn't have timed his arrival better. It had been prophesied a white god would appear in 1519, and here he was, standing before them. The Spaniard wanted to see gold, and the obliging Aztecs showed their new god straight to their treasury. The conquistadors were staggered, and one of their number stated that all the riches of the world were to be found in that single room. When the inevitable hostilities broke out, the Spanish murdered Montezuma and made straight for his treasure room. But the vaults were empty. The treasure was gone. But the Spaniards hadn't traveled this far to simply give up on the biggest cache of booty they'd ever laid their eyes on. And when it came to cruelty, the conquistadors could teach the Aztecs a trick or two. They wanted that treasure and were prepared to do whatever it took to find out where it was. It was said that not a single Aztec cracked. Freddy then read later accounts, stating that the treasure had been spirited away to the north, to the fabled original homeland of the Aztecs, Aztlan, located in what is now the southwest of the USA. Legend has it that the Aztec warriors were sealed up with the treasure in a cave. Their mission, to protect their emperor's treasure from anyone who broke in to steal it. And now, at last, Freddy realized the meaning of his vision. He was convinced he'd seen the army of slaves carrying the treasure trove as far north as the Colorado River. At that point, the vision had blurred. But then one tantalizing clue was revealed, and Freddy believed this was the marker pointing to the location of Montezuma's treasure.
He did have one clue, and the clue he had was a petroglyph that had been carved onto a red wall.
But the southwestern states of America are full of red canyons, covered with thousands of petroglyphs. For Freddy to find one particular petroglyph somewhere out in the vast wilderness seemed an impossible task. Freddy Crystal had hit a brick wall. Months later, Freddy had pretty much given up on ever finding the treasure. Then one evening, after a hard day's prospecting, Freddy decided to catch up on the local news. His eye was drawn to one article. It was all about a Mormon elder, a Mr. Levi E. Young.
And he had gone down to Kanab to conduct some church business, and then had, for fun, taken some pictures and done just some sightseeing of the gorgeous country down there.
But it was the photograph that really made Freddy sit up. There was no doubt about it. It was the very same image he had seen in his panoramic vision. And Levi Young had now told him where it was. It was somewhere on a canyon wall, somewhere near a town called Kanab. Freddie jumped on his bike and headed 300 miles to the south. He was convinced he was finally honing in on the long-lost treasure. But Freddie's blind faith in his cause wasn't shared by the devout Mormons down in Kanab.
Most of the people in Kanab did not give him the time of day, but one gentleman was willing to take a chance on Freddie, and his name was Oscar Robinson. He owned a ranch, and he agreed to let Freddie come stay at his ranch.
Oscar Robinson took Freddie in and gave him free board and lodging.
This was a cowboy ranch. Oscar Robinson had a bunch of livestock, some sheep and some cows, and so he helped subsidize and give Freddie a stake.
A lot of the other ranchers didn't like Freddie. He was a bit of a freeloader, and his one purpose to be in Kanab was to find the gold.
Freddie had landed on his feet. The Robinson Ranch was right in the heart of the canyons surrounding Kanab. It was prime petroglyph hunting territory. Every morning, Freddie would set out early from the ranch. He needed to check every single yard of the vast canyons and cliffs radiating out for miles, all around Kanab.
Kanab is a town that is surrounded by beautiful red cliffs. It's rugged country. It's huge. I mean, we're almost next to the Grand Canyon.
Many of the canyon walls are covered with petroglyphs. Freddie had to check out every single one.
And so for one person to try and pinpoint the exact location was an overwhelming task.
But not for Freddie. He was a man on a mission dictated by a vision.
He searched the hills for about 2 years, all the while the ranchers at Oscar Robinson's ranch making fun of him nightly, telling him he was crazy.
Freddie would also show the photograph to anyone who would still give him the time of day. And then, in 1916, he finally got some fantastic news. One man had seen the petroglyph that Freddie thought would point him to the location of the treasure. Crystal couldn't believe how he could have overlooked it. It was just 2 miles up the road from the Robinson Ranch. And then he found out how.
Some told him that the petroglyph had been blasted off the wall.
It seems a farmer had wanted to create a shelter under the rock to store hay. And he had unwittingly reduced Freddie's vital marker to Montezuma's treasure to a sad heap of sand in an instant. Freddie Crystal seemed to have taken the news badly and vanished just as suddenly as he had appeared. And the people of Kanab assumed it was the last they would ever see of the wild-eyed man and his tall tales of lost treasure. Then, in early 1922, a familiar figure was seen cycling along Johnson Canyon.
They were very surprised 6 years later when Freddie showed up back in town.
Freddie made a beeline for the Robinson Ranch. He had some great news for his old partner, Oscar.
And he said he had spent the last 6 years in Mexico finding a map.
After the sudden destruction of the petroglyph, a desperate Freddie had recalled his fevered vision. He had seen the vast procession of slaves leave what he now knew was the capital of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan. In their rage at not finding the treasure, the Spanish razed the ancient Aztec city to the ground and rebuilt it as Mexico City. Freddy traveled to the city and once there, heard an intriguing rumor. It was said that one Aztec had been caught by the Spanish and he had a map. Furthermore, the map revealed the location of Montezuma's treasure. In the mayhem during the bloody Spanish conquest, the precious map had been lost. Freddy learned that the old colonial records were stored in the basement of a monastery. So in the dead of night, Freddy Crystal jumped the wall and broke in. And finally, he found exactly what he was looking for.
The map described an area. It had a cliff. Below the cliff, there was supposed to be a marsh, and then it was surrounded by 7 mountains.
The cliffs and marshes reminded Freddy of the landscape in Johnson Canyon, but included something he had never seen on his many trips through the hills. A set of steps leading upwards. Freddy was convinced the treasure had to be hidden at the top, behind the entrance.
When Freddy returned, it was almost like a rewind. Once again, he started searching the hills. He would hike to the top of mountains with his map in hand.
Freddy was looking for a spot where he could see 7 mountains lined up as on the map.
Once he got to the top of different cliffs and mountains, he would pull out his map and he would try to match the different geographical landmarks.
And now he had a map. Some of the younger cowboys started to show more interest in Freddy's story. Alvin Judd, Oscar Robinson's 16-year-old son-in-law, was particularly keen. In his spare time, Alvin and his pal Cowhide Adams would join Freddy on his search. Freddy told them when they found the steps, they would lead to a cave sealed up with a layer of mortar. Behind this wall would be an army of ghostly Aztec warriors standing guard over the treasure. But most of the time, Freddy was out on his own, scouring the canyons to try and find the spot where the 7 mountains all lined up. And then on Thanksgiving in 1922, Freddy scanned the horizon and suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. He pulled out his map and...
That was the day that he found the perfect match, picture perfect. Everything was there, the 7 mountains, the cliff, the marsh beneath, it all fit.
Footsore Freddy couldn't believe his luck. He had finally done it. He rounded up the young cowboys, Alvin Judd and Cowhide Adams, and they raced off to what they hoped was the cliff containing the treasure cave. Crystal scanned the canyon. He was looking for a set of steps cut into the rock face.
They found the cliff, they were at the bottom, and they saw that there were stone steps going up.
Freddy scrambled ahead, leaving the youngsters for dust.
And all the excitement and all the blood pressure went up, and here's going to be the gold.
Freddy was looking for something out of the ordinary in the rock face, some feature that didn't quite fit in.
When they got up to the mountain where the steps were, they were looking around trying to find an opening, which there wasn't, but there was a little indention.
It was as though Crystal had a sixth sense. Somehow he just knew there was something special about this spot.
He actually pulled out a pocket knife right then and there.
Immediately they started digging with their pocket knives, with their hands, anything that they could open up that face with.
And beneath the soft sandy face, there was something harder.
It was like mortar in between rocks.
The mortar was made from limestone, a mineral not found in Johnson Canyon.
The closest is found 20 miles from here. So obviously, somebody had brought that here to close up that wall, and it had to be the Aztecs.
Freddie believed he was now just feet away from the riches that had been snatched away from Cortez and his conquistadors.
Any moment he knew, Freddie knew he was going to break through that wall and find a mass cavern of riches that the Aztecs had stored there.
And then suddenly, they were through.
And they figured, oh my goodness, here it is.
Freddie told the youngsters to hold back while he went in to scout out the cave. He knew the cave was reputed to be guarded by a long-dead army of Aztec warriors. Freddie edged nervously along the sandy cavern. And then...
there was actually a booby trap, and a boulder had rolled onto one of his legs and had actually pinned him there.
Was this the curse of Montezuma? Freddie desperately shouted for help, and Alvin Judd rushed to his aid.
If he had been alone, it could have been fatal. He could have died there in the caves.
There was no sign of Aztec warriors. But now they were worried. There could be more dangerous booby traps lying just up ahead.
The excitement withdrew.
The brush with death quickly sobered the mood amongst the trio of treasure hunters.
It was dangerous. It was more than they could handle.
And that's when they went to town and says, we've got to get the word out. We've got to get more people up here.
Freddie rushed back to Kanab. He was anxious to tell everyone he was on the verge of finding Montezuma's treasure. But he needed help, and lots of it.
And once word had got out that he had found the treasure cave, the whole town loved Freddie. It wasn't Freddie the freak or Freddie the weirdo anymore.
Finally convinced that Freddie may be onto something, the whole community decided to help dig out the treasure, and then they would all share out the spoils.
If you go back to the design of the community and how the western part of this country worked was community-based. So it worked the same way with this adventure on finding Montezuma's treasure. Everybody worked together.
Within days, Kanab effectively shut up shop. The townsfolk jumped in their buggies and rode to Johnson Canyon to dig out the treasure.
For a town like Kanab to completely shut down, it's really quite remarkable.
All of a sudden, a little community blossomed up down in the bottom of the canyon, and they began to dig.
They had jobs, just like as if they were in town. Some people were in charge of the water. They had people that were in charge of the cooking, the cleaning, the digging.
In the 1920s, what they used to dig with was shovels, picks, rakes, buckets, anything that they could find. Everything had to be done by hand. They'd have a bunch of buckets and a line brigade. So one would take a bucket, hand it to the next, like you're putting out a fire.
Everybody had a part, and it ran like oiled clockwork because everybody wanted that treasure.
These are ranchers, farmers, and working is their living. And so they kind of put their lives on hold for Freddie Crystal.
In the 1920s, Kanab was one of the most isolated communities in the USA. But they knew completely closing down the town could attract unwanted attention.
It was like a tent city here in Johnson Canyon, and certain people were left in town to make it look like the town was still busy and that it was thriving.
The people of Kanab were used to thinking independently. In 1912, they had appointed the world's first all-woman council.
the all-woman town council levied a fine on anyone who spoke the word treasure out loud. They wanted to take all precautions to make sure that no outsiders would hear of the treasure and try to come and claim some of the gold for themselves.
The Women Council, they put a lid on it, and that information didn't get out very far at the time.
But despite the Petticoat Council's best efforts, pretty soon rumors began to spread. Strange things were afoot down in Kane County.
There's a story of two gentlemen from Salt Lake City who managed to hear something that was going on down in Kanab, got excited about it, rode down. When they got to Kanab, everything was closed. The businesses, no one was home.
Apparently, a stable lad let the cat out of the bag and pointed the strangers towards Johnson's Canyon.
When they got there, they didn't get very close to where the people were working and before someone pulled a gun on them and said, "You need to leave." And they did.
Untroubled by intruders, the big dig continued apace. When they got to the end of the first cave, they broke through a wall, but found yet another series of caverns stretching back into the mountain. There was no sign of gold, just tons of dirt.
People were starting to doubt that there was actually even any treasure to be found.
That next shovelful, because that's what kept everybody going. It's just going to be the next shovelful. But when does that next shovelful stop?
One by one, people were beginning to lose faith in Freddie Crystal.
Slowly, people started to give up the search and would, gradually head back to their farms and their families and their way of life again.
But a hard core of diggers carried on, driven on by thoughts of treasure.
I'm sure that there was a lot of people felt, just one more shovelful.
And after 2 long years, the remaining gold diggers were finally on the verge of breaking through to the last cavern.
Everybody was seeing gold in their eyes. Any moment, the next shovelful, they're going to get it.
They finally broke through the cave wall, but were faced with a heartbreaking sight.
Somebody told me they found an old Spaniard helmet. I think a half of a moccasin they found back in there. There wasn't much for as much time as they spent. There wasn't any gold. They certainly didn't find any gold. I can't imagine what their hearts might have felt.
But Freddie Crystal had spent well over 10 years looking for the treasure, and he wasn't about to quit now.
Freddie himself was discouraged, so he took another look at the map. And it hit him that the tunnels were probably just a temporary holding of the treasure, and that the place they really needed to look was underneath all of the material they had just removed from the cave.
So Freddie said, "You know what? We have got to dig here where we have been throwing all this stuff for 2 years."
Freddie's sudden change of plan went down like a lead balloon.
The townspeople were not happy with this. They had just spent, quite a long time emptying the tunnels to then be told they needed to move the very same material once again. And they lost interest.
In 1924, the empty-handed townsfolk finally abandoned the dig and turned their backs on the man who had filled their heads full of treasure.
Freddie just disappeared one day, and nobody really knew what happened to Freddie. Some speculated that the townspeople got angry at him and someone murdered him.
It was said he was murdered in fury for all the wasted time. Some thought he was killed for his map, but others believed he had incurred the wrath of Montezuma and thought he may not be the last to die searching for the treasure. But Alvin Judd kept his faith in Freddie and his tales of Aztec gold. And when he had any spare time,
he was up there digging, my grandfather, and with his brothers. He spent 30 years or more up there.
Alvin found no trace of the legendary gold. But it wasn't to be the last the Judd family were to hear about Montezuma and missing Aztec treasure. Freddie Crystal had arrived at Oscar Robinson's ranch in 1914. Almost 70 years later, another stranger showed up, talking about Montezuma and his long-lost treasure. His name was Raymond Dillman.
The Dillmans showed up, and my mother was there alone this particular day.
And this old green van drove up. And it was full of these Spanish-looking people, and they were big people.
My mother was kind of scared because there was, she's out there alone.
And they didn't dare get out of the van. My mom tells this story lots better than I do.
When I saw the occupants in there, it really quite frightened me for a minute, and I thought, oh no, what would I do? Well, the dogs took care of it.
And those old dogs probably would have licked you to death. Other than that, they would have done a thing to you, but they had a big bark.
Orrinell Judd eventually summoned up all her courage.
I went over there and he asked me if there were any hieroglyphics on the walls.
And she says, yeah, there's some right there by the house.
And he said, well, can I see them? He said, sure. So she walked over there and showed him.
Raymond Dillman was looking for petroglyphs of 3 animals, all in a line. Below them, 3 circles.
And it was the exact pictures that he was looking for.
But there was one final image Dillman needed to account for.
Well, do you have this big bullseye? Yeah, there's one down the canyon.
The bullseye petroglyph, a 9-spiraled circle, confirmed Ray Dillman's theory.
And he says, the Montezuma treasure is buried on your property. I said, oh, really?
Is that what turned your hair white?
Yes, all of a sudden.
Any other family would probably have politely asked Ray Dillman to leave, but not the Judds.
It's unusual, and it pricked our interests because naturally it was in our family, or we'd been part of Freddie Crystal and the whole 9 yards, and then to have somebody else come out of the blue and come right to there, and then for us to be able to take him right to the picture because we knew they were there.
It's been in my family a long time. And this Dillman story of coming to our doorstep and continuing the saga in the 70s, early 80s, was amazing to us.
Raymond Dillman told the Judds he had spent the previous 16 years studying a curious set of tablets called the Peralta Stones. The stones were found in the 1950s, buried by a highway in Arizona. The Peralta Stones are thought by some to be a map to the legendary Dutchman's Mine in Arizona. But Ray Dillman believed the stones had led him directly to the petroglyphs on the Judd Ranch, what he claimed was the site of Montezuma's treasure.
The picture of the horse's head and so forth is what was on the ranch. The rest of the tablets actually had the map, the etchings of the map to how that's how they got there. That's how they got to Johnson Canyon.
Dillman claimed both Aztec and Native American ancestry, and this had enabled him to decipher the symbols on the stones. And if the stone map was good enough for Ray Dillman, it was sure good enough for Bruce and Brent Judd. The brothers got themselves an excavator and headed down the canyon, aiming straight for the bullseye.
And we started digging this place out.
In the 1920s, the whole town of Kanab had turned out with buckets and spades. 60 years later, it was just 2 men, but they had their heavyweight excavator.
The amount of dirt that we moved was 30 or 40 or 50 times more than what they did. When you think that they didn't have any equipment, everything was handmade.
After a few days of digging, there was a huge pile of dirt and rock at the base of the cliff. The ground under the 9-spiral bullseye was now exposed, and they soon made a grisly find. Bones. Lots of bones.
Half their bodies had been burned. We're going, oh my gosh, he told us they were going to be here.
But it wasn't just bones. They hit a ledge, and suddenly a small object tumbled down towards them.
And it came running down towards us, and we all backed up and thought, oh my heck, this is a skull coming after us. And come to find out, it was just a pot, had clay on the top of it, and inside was 213 turquoise beads.
It wasn't yet Montezuma's treasure, but it seemed a very good sign of the riches to come.
So you can imagine how our hearts were pumping. You can imagine the gold in our eyes.
Just above the site was a strange-looking rock that further encouraged the brothers that they were on the right track.
We call it the sacrificial stone. It was big enough that a man 6 or 7 foot tall could be laid out on this stone, and it had a drain line where it would actually drain off the face of the cliff down off this face.
The find had the brothers reaching for their history books. They quickly learned all about the Aztecs' fondness for blood sacrifice. So had they found the execution site of the slaves who had carried the treasure from the Aztec capital in the early 1500s?
My thought was, dang, this is a place where they sacrificed, because the blood could naturally go off the edge of the cliff.
We figured it was that they were probably the Aztecs, and that they'd beaten the people.
And when they excavated further, under the cliff, they found a set of flat stones.
We'd take that cover stone off, and the hole was completely full of sand. We'd go in and dig out that hole, go down about 8 feet, and then we thought we had a tunnel. Here's the entrance to the cave. Montezuma's is just the next shovelful. 2 feet in diameter, just enough for one person to get down in there. And guess what we found? Bodies.
There were stones placed over the openings. And the first one that we opened up was just chock-a-block full of bones, human bones. The bones had been cannibalized, they'd been eaten.
The Judd brothers had clearly uncovered a burial ground. But could the bones be the remains of Aztec slaves that had carried the treasure far from the south? The answer turned out to be no. Carbon dating revealed the skeletons were from around 2000 BC. Predating the fall of Montezuma by 3,500 years. These were not the bones of the Aztec slaves. It was a body blow for Brent and Bruce, and they called a halt to their hunt. However, the brothers remain convinced that Montezuma's treasure exists, and it is out here in the wild country surrounding Kanab.
It's here. It's definitely here.
It's here. I believe that Montezuma's treasure is here someplace.
And Bruce now claims he knows where some of the treasure is actually hidden.
I can probably say that I know where part of it is, but I'm not, I'll never go to it. I'll never go after it.
Bruce now believes it is far too dangerous to hunt the treasure.
Yeah, there's people who've lost their lives. The one took his boy back to see it, and a rattlesnake actually killed his son. And so there's some wild stories back in there. They've actually had some of the old Indians come back and say, it's not time, leave it alone.
The fact that the treasure may be cursed was whispered around Kanab, but it didn't deter everyone in town. Brant Child was a good friend of the Judds, but he was convinced the treasure wasn't at their ranch. He thought it was hidden under this lake, just north of Kanab. He too believed the Aztecs finally halted here after fleeing the Spanish, and that this was part of their legendary homeland, Aztlan.
These Aztecs decided they had to leave and take their treasure elsewhere. So they came back to their homeland, back to this country. And they knew they had to put it someplace where Cortez wouldn't get it.
Brant Child said that when the Aztecs arrived here, the lake didn't exist. The slaves had dug a tunnel into the cliff, walled up the treasure, then flooded the valley. His son Lon explains.
There was probably around 4,000 to 6,000 warriors. The theory is that they actually killed the warriors that brought the gold here. And the Aztecs believed in the afterlife. And so their assignment was to protect this area.
But thousands of dead Aztec warriors were not going to deter a man like Brandt Child.
When he wanted to go after something, he really went after it.
Brandt brought in dive teams to explore the underwater cave. But the divers quickly swam into trouble.
We had a professional group of divers out of San Francisco that came down. They came down with $100,000 worth of equipment. What happened with them is their equipment kept breaking down. And they just had all kinds of trouble.
Linda lost her air. And when we got back out, Linda's air tank had been turned completely off. Nothing wrong with the tank itself. She had plenty of air in the tank, but it had just been turned off.
The divers could offer no rational explanation for the constant equipment malfunctions. But they all agreed that there was something strange happening in the underwater cavern.
They were seeing all kinds of ghostly figures, a lot of crazy things.
He says, I'm being choked, I'm being choked. I can see ghostly figures all around me and they're choking me. I can't breathe, I can't breathe. Get me out, get me out.
Tony Thurber had been a professional diver for over 20 years.
I've been diving all over the world, and I've never had a terrifying experience as scary as this one was.
And it wasn't just the diver who had a close brush with death that day.
We woke up late that night, and the room was full of propane gas. And propane is very deadly. And so we had to leave the room, and I have no idea why it leaked. It had never leaked before and never leaked after.
Although strange, inexplicable things were happening in the cave, there was no shortage of fresh divers ready to take up the challenge.
There was many different divers that came down and had pretty much the same experience almost every time.
Every single dive ended in failure. Brandt Child now decided on a radical solution.
The easiest way would have been to access the treasure would have been just to drain the lake. And what Dad wanted to do to drain it, actually, is just dig a big trench and drain it out into a field.
But there was a problem.
The federal government got wind of that, and they went to Dad and they threatened him. They said, you don't touch that lake.
The US Fish and Wildlife Department informed Brandt his lake was home to a critically endangered subspecies, the Kanab amber snail. Killing just one snail would leave Brandt picking up a bill for $50,000. Lon believes it's no coincidence that the rare snails live in the lake. He believes they were put there to guard the treasure.
The Aztecs used a golden snail in their religious rituals. So the theory is that the Aztecs brought their golden snail from Mexico and planted it where they planted the gold. The amber snail is a means of protecting access to the treasure.
With the amber snails successfully blocking the lake route, Brandt now hatched a new plan. He brought in a crew to drill down into the cave. But then one of the crew had an unusual experience.
He said, it's the strangest thing because I looked over on this knoll and there was an Indian standing there in full Indian garb and he was holding a spear. And I said, oh, come on. And he said, well, I started going about my business again, and then I looked back to see if he was still there and he was gone.
If this was a warning, the drillers chose to ignore it. And it wasn't long before they broke through to a cavern. And when they brought the drill bit up, they were staggered.
When they pulled the drill bit out, it was flakes of gold on the drill bit tip.
It was an amazing development, and they needed to see just what was down in the cave.
They decided that they'd put a little camera down there. And the story is that when they got the camera in the cavern, they could see a statue and a pile of something.
He said he could see something in the middle of the room that was piled up in the middle of the room, and then he said he'd seen an image over to the side of the door where he figured the door was at, that there was somebody standing there.
Some say it wasn't a statue, it was a figure of a man, and then this pile that they couldn't make out because they didn't have enough lighting. Yeah, they were very excited.
But the excitement of the find was to be overshadowed by tragedy.
And that well driller went home that night, and he had a heart attack and died. And then what I understand is a few weeks later, his wife died too.
His own brother won't come to this very day and get the drilling rig that's still parked right up there up on top.
And then, Brandt got a visit from a mysterious Native American.
Dad said, well, that was the strangest thing. This Indian just came out and he told me that the treasure was here, but it is to be used for the Indians, to unite the Indian tribes, and that bad things would happen to you if you continue to go after it, so you need to quit trying to go after it.
And this wasn't the end of the strange incident.
They both started walking back, following his tracks in this sand, and after a while, his tracks just disappeared. My dad got to the point where he truly believed that it was probably just protected and it wasn't meant to come out, and so he gave up trying.
We can't disturb it. It's designed, it's hid up, and it's protected by these warriors that were left here.
Brandt finally decided to give up his pursuit of Montezuma's treasure. In September 2002, he died in a traffic accident. Some consider the circumstances surrounding his death as somewhat mysterious.
Brandt Childs was killed in Marysville Canyon when he hit a horse in the canyon. A lot of people think it could have been because he disturbed the treasure. Some people believe it's cursed.
It's been cursed with a curse to protect it.
Some now believe that the treasure belongs to the descendants of the Aztecs, the Native American people.
The legend says that there's a chosen one and that he will be able to come and access the treasure and that it will be used for the Indians.
Like I say, when the time's right, then it'll come out.
Lon Child has brought a halt to any attempts to get hold of the treasure at the lake.
We're gonna let the Aztecs sleep. Yeah, they can have their treasure.
Today, many in Kanab are convinced that the 6,000 Aztec warriors continue their silent vigil. They believe the warriors await anyone reckless enough to disturb the treasure of their long-dead emperor, the mighty Montezuma. In 2001, South Africa found itself in the grip of gold fever.
It escalated beyond control.
A small-town businessman might have stumbled upon a long-lost fortune, the Kruger millions.
There was talk of £1 million and more.
This was the reputed war chest of legendary Boer statesman Paul Kruger. But in the confusion of a savage war, it disappeared.
People believed that some of the coins was hidden somewhere, was buried.
For over a century, treasure hunters had been seeking this elusive hoard of gold and chasing the legend of one rogue soldier who claimed to know its location.
He became known as the man who hid the Kruger millions.
This is the story of a missing fortune, a double-crossing spy, and a wary skeptic swept up in the adventure of a lifetime.
But when you see that, it's like, oh my God, this is true. I was completely convinced that this was the Kruger million.
May 1900. The first war of the 20th century. The Boer War was raging. In the midst of this brutal conflict, a vast fortune unaccountably vanished. According to legend, it was buried somewhere in the wide open grasslands of the South African bushveld. This treasure, named in honor of Paul Kruger, one of South Africa's founding fathers, is known as the Kruger Millions.
I believe probably a very large percentage of South Africans know about the Kruger Millions, and you'll actually be amazed how many people are actually aware of it.
The Kruger Millions consists of an untold number of solid gold coins, each bearing the head of Paul Kruger himself. They were minted to fund his people's fight against the greatest superpower of the day, the British Empire.
This is one of the 1900 pounds. This is gold, 95% pure gold, hardened slightly with some other material because pure gold is very soft.
The most valuable of these so-called Kruger pounds can fetch up to £6,000 each at auction.
It's not because they're gold. These are valuable because they have a connection with South Africa's history.
Ever since the end of the war in 1902, people have been searching for this treasure trove of buried gold. Athol Stark knew the legend as well as anyone. He is a successful businessman in a bustling town called Ermelo, in the heart of the South African veldt. For most of his life, Athol never paid much attention to rumors of gold buried in the plains beyond the edge of town.
I'm not a treasure hunter. I'm not a person that every weekend or every day off puts my spade across my shoulder. I'm a business person. It was never a subject of interest to me at all.
But at the turn of the 21st century, an extraordinary series of events would change Athol's life forever. He would unwittingly become the central figure in one of the strangest gold rushes of all time. His story has the most ordinary of beginnings, when a man with debt problems came calling in 1999.
A gentleman arrived at my home that is very well known to me, and he asked for my help. His motor car was about to be repossessed because he'd failed to pay 3 months of payments.
Athol often gave financial advice, and there was nothing unusual about this particular client, until the moment he mentioned a relative who had come into some money.
Right at the end, it said that his uncle was perhaps somebody that could help him because the uncle had coins. He didn't say money, he said coins. And obviously I've zoned in on the coins thing because this was, and I said to him, you're talking about money? And he said, no, coins, like what kind of coins? And he kind of said, coins like this, that size, and it's yellow and it's got Kruger's head on it.
The coins the man described were clearly none other than Kruger pounds. Athol suddenly saw a chance to strike it rich. Possibly this was just some kind of scam. Then again, perhaps, just perhaps, these coins were genuine and part of the famed Kruger Millions.
I told him that the only way that I would be interested in even getting involved is I needed to see at least 1,000 of these coins. And it was just a number. It wasn't like a determined amount of money. It was just kind of, I need to see 1,000 of these coins before I would even get involved.
Much to Athol's surprise, the very next day he received an invitation to visit a nearby black township. The Zulu client and his elderly relatives wanted to meet Athol and show him 1,000 gold coins, just as he requested.
They came in with 3 paraffin tins, and just by looking at them, you could see these things were pretty old. They opened up one of them and they poured out a reasonable amount of coins onto the table.
There, on the table in front of Athol, were dozens of Kruger pounds, with many hundreds more waiting to be poured out.
Up to the moment where they walked in with those paraffin cans, I didn't actually believe. I thought it was a scam. I thought I was going to get robbed.
In that moment, the mythical treasure had become real.
Yes, they were Kruger coins. Yes, they were gold.
Then Athol made a critical mistake by trying to inspect one of the coins. As far as the family was concerned, Athol was there to look, not to touch. He was unceremoniously shoved off the property, and he assumed he would never hear from these people again. However, 2 weeks later, Athol got a phone call. The Zulu family now had a business proposition. They wanted his help to sell some of their coins.
I managed to find somebody that could purchase coins, set up a deal with these people, and it appears that they were able to sell quite a number of coins.
In exchange for setting up the deal, Athol was given a handsome reward. 42 Kruger pounds, worth tens of thousands in today's money.
The grandmother's attitude had changed quite dramatically. She basically gave me 2 handfuls of gold coins, and I was made to understand that this was a thank you for the fact that I had helped them, you know, with all the problems that they'd had in selling the coins.
Once, Athol didn't believe the Kruger millions even existed. Now, he found himself holding his own small piece of it. Athol was transformed from wary skeptic into a true believer.
I'd go and open up the safe and line them up on the dresser and look at them in the mirror, because it was just so almost unbelievable that we had something so tangible which is related back to so much confusion about this thing. And you just look at them, it's sort of like this wonder of where these things were.
What's more, if the legend was right, the coins Athol had seen were just a small part of a huge motherlode, which had been missing for a century.
I mean, this is a fabulous wealth even in that time. Now it's billions of rands if all records are to be believed. If we look at this information, what happened to that money? We started to ask a lot of people a lot of questions.
If Athol could find it, he would be wealthy beyond imagination. But before he could begin to dig for gold, he had to delve deep into the past. He needed to know the truth behind the Kruger millions and how it disappeared. Athol's research took him right back to the late 19th century. At that time, South Africa was a divided country. The undisputed power in the land was the British Empire. But the Boers, Afrikaans-speaking white farmers, held a large swathe of territory and refused to join the imperial fold.
The Afrikaners wanted freedom from the British, just as much as we colonials wanted freedom from the British in 1776.
The British had tolerated Boer autonomy for years, but in 1886, everything changed. The world's richest goldfields were discovered in the heart of Boer territory. Britain wanted them for herself.
When the Boers did not just want to willingly hand over the country, and because of the gold that had been discovered in the Witwatersrand, which is the Johannesburg area, they invaded South Africa with thousands and thousands of British troops.
War was inevitable, and it broke out on the 11th of October, 1899.
The British government and the military thought this was going to be a pushover. This would be over by Christmas.
The Boer survival depended on the cunning prowess of their political leader, Paul Kruger.
Paul Kruger was an Afrikaner or Boer whose shadow was cast all over South Africa in the second half of the 19th century. He almost personifies Boer independence.
From this modest house in his capital, Pretoria, Kruger orchestrated a two-pronged plan for victory. First, he had to keep his country's gold out of British hands. He ordered millions of ounces to be extracted from the country's mines and sent for safekeeping to this building, the Transvaal Mint. Here, almost all of it was turned into coins, each worth £1 South African pound.
Nobody outside the government knew how much gold there was in state possession now. There was talk of £1 million and more, but what nobody really knew.
Second, Kruger knew his small citizen militia could never defeat the mighty British army in head-to-head combat. So he told them to rely on guerrilla warfare.
It was hit-and-run tactics. Men who were not expected to have any military background turned out to be quite good strategists.
For several months, the fast-moving Boer armies had the advantage. One of their best fighters was a young officer named Fritz Joubert Duquesne, a man who would soon become inextricably linked to the legend of the Kruger millions.
Fritz was born in South Africa, and he was educated at schools in South Africa and then in Britain, where he claimed to become the handsomest man in Europe and the finest swordsman in Europe. And he returned to South Africa to participate in the Boer War.
Like most Boer fighters, Duquesne had a family farm in the heart of the war zone. And while the men were at the front, the women were left to tend it on their own. The British knew this, and infuriated with their inability to defeat the Boers in a so-called fair fight, they resorted to an utterly ruthless strategy: scorched earth.
British army devastated the region by destroying all the farms, removing all the people, putting them into concentration camps.
One day, the British came calling to the Duquesne family farm.
His farm was totally destroyed, crops burned, and family imprisoned. Of course, they had no defense against the British soldiers.
The soldiers reportedly raped and killed Duquesne's sister, and then raped his mother, before taking her away to a concentration camp.
Fritz's family were imprisoned, and that's where his mother died. He developed this great hate for the British, and he had this hate all his life.
Duquesne declared himself Britain's arch-enemy, vowing to kill 100 Englishmen for every drop of his family's spilt blood. What's more, he hatched a daring plan to strike at the empire itself. He would ensure that Britain would not be able to claim a single ounce of South African gold. If he pulled it off, he would be a hero, and possibly a very rich man. By late May 1900, the Empire's army was at the gates of Pretoria. With the vaults full of gold under threat, Paul Kruger took drastic action to save his struggling nation and its vast riches.
On Monday, the 4th of June, the gold was weighed, put into boxes. They were put onto wagons, and by about noon, they were taken to Victoria Station, where they were put onto a train.
In broad daylight, every penny of the money was rushed through the streets of Pretoria. At the station, a special train was prepared to carry it to safety.
And this was happening just literally minutes before the British invaded the area.
As the train moved off, the first British shells were bursting around them.
The plan appeared to be a brilliant success. When the British finally arrived in the city, they found that Kruger was gone. And so was all the gold. The mint was empty. But to get the gold out in time, Kruger had blown one of his best-kept secrets.
The whole way of how the gold was removed from the mint on Church Square really started the Kruger million rumor. And there's a wonderful story about that, because it was done in the open.
Kruger had to get the gold to Europe, where he could buy arms and supplies for his ragtag army. But the British controlled the entire South African coastline, and most of the railways too. Kruger was trapped, and so was the gold. The only possible exit was via Delagoa Bay in the neighboring Portuguese colony of Mozambique. The gold-laden train sped for the border.
This train was on the railway line from Pretoria to Delagoa Bay, and this railway line was the only one that was not in British hands yet. The government withdrew along the railway line towards a little town called Machadodorp.
Machadodorp was the last town in Boer territory, and in the dead of night, the train stopped there. On this unassuming railway siding, Kruger ordered a small party of officials to set up a government in exile. Leaving them behind, Kruger himself escaped to Mozambique. But, fearing capture on the high seas by the Royal Navy, he left without the money.
The money was on the train, and the train was parked at Machadodorp. After that, it kind of gets a bit foggy, because in a war situation, there's not a lot of bookkeeping and note-taking of what's really going down.
Into this fog of war stepped none other than Fritz Duquesne. After the death of his family, Duquesne had become one of the most notorious guerrillas in the Boer army, nicknamed the Black Panther of the Veldt. Knowing his exploits would endear him to the Boer High Command, Duquesne went to Machadodorp and offered to help protect the gold.
He had fought in a couple of battles, and he also claimed that he was a relative of Piet Joubert, who was a military leader among the South Africans, and so it was not difficult for him to be placed in charge.
By now, the British were closing fast on the few remaining Boer strongholds. The Kruger millions were in great danger. To save them, Duquesne was apparently entrusted to take the lot by wagon and bury it in a secret location. A party of soldiers was assigned to accompany him, but sworn to secrecy. Duquesne did not tell them they were escorting a great fortune in gold. Only Duquesne knew what was really in the wagons.
There were about 30 wagons, and as they penetrated further, many of the men found out that there was gold. They didn't realize there was gold in bullion in the wagons, and so they wanted to steal it themselves.
The wagon train spent 2 weeks trekking through the veldt, avoiding the ever more frequent British patrols. As it traveled, Duquesne's companions plotted to kill him and steal the money. Their moment came at a remote campsite. In the dead of night, one drove a knife into Duquesne's bedroll, thinking he was inside. He wasn't. The bedroll was stuffed with clothes, and Duquesne was hiding in the shadows with his rifle. The next morning, Duquesne ordered his African servants to bury the gold in a cave, somewhere near the town of Ermelo. He then set them free on the promise that they would never divulge its location.
So one of his sobriquets became the man who hid the Kruger millions.
Duquesne's plan was simple. If the Boers won the war, then he would simply uncover the gold and return with it to Pretoria, claiming a hero's welcome and no doubt a handsome reward. If they lost, then all the money would be his to keep.
Fritz took the gold, as he would claim, for patriotic reasons, because when the Boer government was restored, the money the gold could be used. But primarily, it was greed. I'm sure it was greed.
But war has a habit of wrecking even the best laid plans. Several months after burying the gold, Duquesne was ambushed by a British patrol. He survived the attack, but he was now a captive of his arch-enemy. And the British had a special treatment reserved for the most dangerous, irreconcilable Boer fighters such as him. They exiled them 8,000 miles away to one of the farthest flung corners of the empire.
There were a number of Afrikaners, or Boers, who were bitter enders, or bitter einders, I believe they called themselves, who would not capitulate, and these were sent to Bermuda. And Fritz was one of those who was sent to Bermuda.
In 1902, the Boer War ended with a British victory. The irony was not lost on Fritz Duquesne, marooned in Bermuda. He no doubt believed the Kruger millions now belonged to him. If only he could make it back to South Africa. Duquesne escaped from his prisoner of war camp and stowed away on board a yacht bound for New York. But in America, Duquesne was diverted by the prospect of becoming a popular hero.
Fritz used his background to bring celebrity to himself, and he did this by lecturing on his adventures in South Africa. He was his own best promoter. And he was a very good speaker, and as much as he hated the British, he spoke with a British accent.
Why should Duquesne dig for buried gold when he could sell stories about it? He began to make a handsome living as the man who hid the Kruger millions. Meanwhile, word of his exploits soon made it back to South Africa. They became mixed up with the rumors about Paul Kruger and his dramatic escape on a train full of gold. The legend of the Kruger millions was born.
There are various stories. Everybody knew somebody who had seen it being done, but nobody had seen it being buried. There was the story of people having buried some of the coins near Ermelo.
Of all the possible places where the treasure could be buried, one of the most likely was Ermelo, Athol Stark's hometown. By the end of 1999, Athol had developed a serious case of gold fever. His research revealed that Ermelo had been a hotbed of treasure hunting for decades. Many people in town had managed to strike it rich down the years. Perhaps he could be the next. The first were a pair of impoverished Boer farmers, 80 years previously.
In 1921, two brothers were building a small dam to try and catch the spring water for their cattle. And while they were digging there, they came across something.
What they discovered was a buried cache of golden Kruger pounds. Within days, they retired to live a life of leisure.
They said that they had got an inheritance from Uncle Paul.
Uncle Paul was an affectionate name for Paul Kruger. In the years that followed, a number of other farmers in the area also became mysteriously wealthy, thanks to old Uncle Paul.
At the end of the Anglo-Boer War, Afrikaners went into poverty. These people were what could be called destitute. But there's a problem here. The people were able to rebound very quickly. You know, within a couple of years, they had herds of sheep and herds of cattle, and the question is, where did all this stuff come from?
Athol realized they all had something in common. All of them were working near the edge of this salty lake, about a mile outside Ermelo. It was near this same lake that a Zulu family made another discovery 40 years previously. It was a tale that chilled Athol to the bone.
The big uproar in our town was the coins that were found during the 1960s by a family of black people who worked as farm workers on the farm, actually the farm next door.
In the middle of the night, one member of the family noticed a group of white Afrikaners digging ditches near the salt lake. So one Sunday afternoon, when everybody was at church, they went to investigate.
When the workers were not there, the farmer was not on the farm, and after themselves digging at the spots where these people had been digging. Came across a container, pulled it out of the ground, and it was full of coins. How many? It's impossible to know. It took them apparently a couple of hours, but every container that they had, from cooking pots to kettles to paraffin tins, they loaded it up with the money that they pulled out of this box. And then, of course, the problem was, what do you do with this money?
These were the bad old days of apartheid. And for a black person to be seen with even one Kruger pound, let alone a whole box full, was an invitation to serious trouble.
They realized that, you know, if they hid it in the floor, that it would be found, whatever they did. That afternoon, there was a funeral, elderly gentleman that had passed away. So they took the money and put it at the bottom of the grave and covered it with soil.
Sure enough, the white treasure hunters returned that evening to keep looking for the Kruger millions. Instead, they found their secret digging site had been torn apart. They stormed into the Black Township, looking for their gold.
They demanded to know what had happened, who'd been digging down there, and nobody, of course, was prepared to tell them. So what they did is they grabbed one of the daughters of the people that lived there. And whipped this child in front of everybody, trying to force them to tell them. Of course, nobody knew anything, so they got away with it.
The white men left town, and a couple of weeks later, the Zulus secretly returned to the gravesite where they had buried the money. They dug up their hidden stash of gold, reburied the corpse, and ran for their lives.
They not only left the farm, but also left Ermelo, and they went to live in a neighboring town.
This family was the very same one that Athol encountered in 1999. He had discovered their dark secret. Now it was his secret too. Athol knew exactly where they had found their coins. He knew others had found money in the same place. He knew about the wagon loads of gold passing through the area during the war. Putting all the evidence together, Athol believed that Ermelo was the hiding place of the Kruger millions. If he was right, the mother lode might be right on his doorstep, and he could be the one to find it.
Whether that's the entire Kruger millions or again just a portion, adds a lot of weight to the fact that it appears that there probably was something called the Kruger millions.
Early in 2001, Athol was making plans for his own dig when someone approached him. Incredibly, this man also knew about the fields of gold near the salty lake and Athol's role in the story. He wanted Athol to negotiate access with the white farmers who owned the land. Athol agreed to join him. For the first time, he became a treasure hunter.
We arranged access for them onto the farm, went onto the farm, and they were there for quite a few hours. They brought like a witch doctor called a sangoma. He continually asked for me to be moved away and moved away.
Go away, you devil! Just go! Go away! Go away! Go!
I was about 250 meters away, up on the side of a hill. And I ended up just going right over the top of the hill and lying down in the grass and watching them. And all he was doing, he was walking around and he kept on going back to this one place. And they dug there for a while. And then they called me and they'd found something. What they discovered was this box. Once they got it out, you could see quite clearly it was money.
Astoundingly, the witch doctor had discovered gold.
I think that's the reality that kind of hit home, is that, oh my goodness, this is actually the truth.
Back at Athol's house, the Count began in earnest.
Yeah, it was quite amazing. Thousands of coins. We estimate, if we're correct, about 14,700 was kind of where we stopped.
At last, Athol was about to strike it rich. Under the agreement he struck with his new partners, he was entitled to a portion of anything that was found.
When you see that, you know, it becomes almost like an emotional thing. It's like you stand there and go like, oh my God, this is true.
However, before he could claim his prize, Athol's wife made a crucial mistake.
It was inside our house on a table, and we tried to take a photograph.
What is she doing here? What are you doing? Are you...
When they saw that she'd taken a photograph, they rolled this thing up pretty quickly and left. And we couldn't even stop them. It's guys that suddenly became very aggressive because they had said if we find the coins, they will share the coins with us, they will share it with the farmer. That kind of ended just there and then.
Before Athol or anyone had time to react, the men had jumped in their car with all the money. They were gone, and so was Athol's share of the gold.
The shock was 2 or 3 minutes after they drove out my driveway, oh my goodness, they're just driving away with us. And there's nothing I can do. What am I going to do? Phone the police and tell them somebody just stole the Kruger millions? The cops are going to laugh at me. So they just literally just drove away with us, and there was absolutely nothing I could do.
Within a space of hours, Athol had found a fortune and lost it again. There seemed little hope of Athol ever having his own piece of the Kruger millions.
We honestly believed that we'd found, this is the Kruger millions. We honestly believed it. And they loaded it on and they were gone. That was where you actually almost feel sick, that you actually feel quite ill, that this thing had actually happened while you'd actually stood and actually watched it.
And yet, he still had one more trump card up his sleeve. Very few people knew the exact location where these coins had been uncovered. There had already been at least 3 discoveries of coins near the salty lake. But if the legend was true, they were just the tip of a golden iceberg. Why not return and try to find the main stash? By the middle of the year, Athol was back in the hunt for more gold. And this time, he made his own extraordinary Kruger find.
About 2 kilometers out of town, there's a place that used to be the old way station. And one of the guys there phoned me and said to me, listen, I think you need to come and have a look. We found a statue buried on the property of Paul Kruger.
It was not a cache of Kruger pounds, but a stone pillar bearing Kruger's head. Despite the fact he was keeping the Kruger gold a closely guarded secret, Athol thought the Kruger statue could bring some recognition to his small town. He invited the South African Broadcasting Corporation to Ermelo. He assumed he could publicize the statue while also maintaining a news blackout about the gold. He could not have been more wrong.
The guy asked me a bunch of questions, and when I'd finished answering all the questions about the statue, he then turned around and said, with the mic kind of shoved up in my face, and I said, okay, now tell us all about these coins that people are finding, And immediately, without thinking, I said to him, hold it a moment, turn that camera off, there's no ways I'm answering that question. And without even realizing, the cat was out of the bag.
If Athol's connection to the treasure had been a secret before, it wasn't now. Sure enough, on that evening's news, Athol's vehement denials were broadcast to the nation. Within days, hordes of treasure hunters descended on Ermelo.
It escalated beyond control over the next few weeks. So much so that I was being accosted in the streets by local people who either wanted to know what the story was, or blatantly just said, this is nonsense, what are you doing to our town?
Athol was now a hunted man. Stories appeared as far away as London and Hong Kong about the Kruger millions, and they all named Athol as the one who knew where they were buried.
That led to us just getting to the point. It was just like, hold it a moment, this is just getting too much now. Our lives were being pulled apart. You would walk past our kids' bedrooms and the curtains would be open, and you'd look over into the park next door and there'd be people on the top of the roofs of cars taking photographs of my family, and just like, hold it a moment, this is going too far.
With gold fever spreading rapidly through Ermelo, Athol lost any chance of finding the missing motherlode of the Kruger millions. It was a crushing blow. But in the midst of his despair, Athol had an idea. There was a way to end the gold rush nightmare and placate the gold-hungry fanatics thronging his town. A treasure hunting weekend, open to all comers.
People came already from the Friday. We set up some tents and security guards and things like that. We had a big official gold rush opening where the Mrs. South Africa came and officially cut the ribbon, and all these people ran in on the farm.
Best of all, Athol could still make some money himself. Everyone who wanted to dig had to pay him a fee.
We had already 116 people that had in actual fact booked to actually come and dig here today.
People came in their droves, and anticipation was high. In the first few hours, some more gold coins were uncovered. Then, nothing. Holes were dug in every conceivable hiding place, to no avail. After 2 days of continuous searching, the Kruger millions were nowhere to be found. The few artifacts that were unearthed couldn't even be given away.
These are things that have been dug up, some of them dug up directly at the place where the gold coins were found. The first one is just obviously a piece of quartz that was probably something that was on a mantelpiece. And then various other things, a little statuette of the Holy Family, another statue of Queen Victoria.
The treasure hunt was over. And soon afterwards, Athol decided to put the whole affair behind him. He sold his small collection of Kruger pounds, and he has not been back to the salty lake until today.
The hole that I'm sitting in at the moment is in actual fact the hole where the Zulu-speaking family found quite a large number of coins in the early 1960s. Quite a distance from us, about 400 meters from us, in that open patch of ground over there, they dug quite a large hole, and I actually observed more than 14,700 coins being removed out of the ground.
Athol's quest for the Kruger millions was over. But the search for answers had only just begun. Where did all that gold come from? And where was the rest of the money? Beyond a few coins, could the Kruger millions be just a myth? One possible answer lies with Fritz Duquesne, the fanatical Boer soldier who claimed to have buried 30 wagon loads of gold.
Whenever I hear the name Fritz Duquesne, I get a wry smile. I mean, if there is something happening, and if there's intrigue, he will be involved.
For years after the Boer War, Duquesne continued to live as a minor celebrity in the United States, making his name as the man who hid the Kruger millions. Yet long after the conflict ended, he still carried a burning hatred for the British, blaming them for the death of his family and the demise of his country. During the Great War, he became a spy for Germany, simply to take revenge against Britain. At the outbreak of the Second World War, he volunteered again, this time for the Nazis.
I never came across any information that he had any sympathy for the Nazis or necessarily any sympathy for the Germans. It was his hatred for the British. It was his way of striking out against the British and hopefully as he wanted to destroy the British nation.
Duquesne was ordered to spy on the American arms industry and report on the convoys leaving New York for England. However, his German handler was, in fact, a double agent. This extraordinary footage of Duquesne passing secrets was secretly recorded through a two-way mirror in a carefully orchestrated FBI sting. In the summer of 1941, Duquesne was arrested, along with dozens of co-conspirators.
It made big news. There were 33 of them, and people weren't even aware this was going on. And then suddenly this news broke that a German spy ring was rounded up and captured in New York City.
To this day, the so-called Duquesne spy ring is the largest ever uncovered on American soil. Duquesne was sentenced to 18 years in prison. When he was released in 1954, he was a broken man.
He just managed to eke out an existence living on welfare.
Throughout his life, Duquesne swore that one day he would return to South Africa and uncover the Kruger millions. In fact, after his exile to Bermuda in 1902, he never saw his beloved homeland again. Fritz Duquesne died, penniless and discredited, in New York in 1956. But could it be that in a cave somewhere in the veldt, there are wagon loads of Kruger pounds that Duquesne buried half a century earlier?
Well, for the sake of Fritz, I'd like to think there was, but I don't know. There's really no, all we have is his word for it, but his story is as good as any, I guess. Someone get some shovels and go out there and start digging.
If Duquesne did hide the Kruger millions, then his secrets died with him. So what is the true fate of this elusive treasure? There is no doubt that all of Kruger's gold was loaded onto a train in Pretoria in June 1900. But precisely how much was there? There has never been a full account of the gold's true value. So it's entirely possible that all of the treasure hunters down the years have been chasing a shadow.
Once the Transvaal government had nationalised about 10 mines at the start of the war, in those few months, they only amassed about 100,000 pounds of Kruger coins per month for about 5 or 6 months.
From the start of the war to Pretoria's fall, they could have made, at maximum, about 800,000 Kruger pounds.
So there was never a possibility of millions or even 1 million being available to be buried. It just didn't exist. There wasn't so much available.
There was no such thing as the Kruger millions.
Still, even 800,000 Kruger pounds would be worth tens of millions today. So where are they? Could there still be a motherlode, waiting to be uncovered?
Every later generation had a grandfather who told him about this, who saw the train moving off or saw them packing this into boxes at the Mint on Church Square. So there were people who believed in this.
The truth, sadly, is far more prosaic. For several weeks, the bulk of the gold sat in a railway car at Machadodorp, the Boer headquarters. Word of the train's cargo quickly spread amongst a hungry and impoverished population.
Machadodorp was now a hub of movement and of people, and the public very soon realized there was some gold on that train. And who pitched up? Creditors. And in the next few weeks, they were paid right there in the open.
The bulk of it was given out there in payment of debt.
All the money was quite simply spent. There was nothing left for Fritz Duquesne or anyone else to take away in the apocryphal wagon train. And yet, most of the gold still ended up in the ground, in small amounts, scattered across the countryside.
What you do find are a few Kruger coins that a wealthy farmer had buried before he went on commando in the war.
Boers who were paid in gold Kruger pounds would return home with the money to their farms, fearing the arrival of the British and their scorched earth tactics. The safest thing was often to bury it.
The idea of this, of course, was that these wealthy farmers said, let's keep this and that we've got something to fall back onto after the war. But obviously then some of them were killed and didn't come back, and so that buried piece of gold was never found until a later stage.
This explains the caches of gold uncovered in Ermelo down the years. They were undoubtedly valuable finds, but there were isolated pockets of money, buried by individual farmers. They could not have been part of a great motherlode. There was no motherlode.
My father had a few Kruger pounds that were dug up in a fish pond of an old Boer farmstead.
Still, there is gold out there, buried in the wide open expanse of the veldt. And although it may not be millions, some lucky treasure hunters could still get very, very rich.
Do we believe that this is the Kruger millions? Not the Kruger millions, but we believe that it is a portion. There probably was something called the Kruger millions. I do definitely believe that.
The legend of the Kruger millions lives on.